so just the opportunities weren't there, and I've since, become a mainlander, but it took me a while. And I was actually doing I was focusing on probation work, so community corrections, and so the opportunities, again, weren't there, and so there was some opportunity in Abbotsford. And so I moved, and when I moved, I actually didn't even really know where Abbotsford was. I was pretty island bound for many of my years, and I generally kind of knew where Abbotsford was, but had never been there, and so started working there in probation. And what I discovered was there was a large South Asian population there, and often what was happening was these were folks coming in. Often first language was Punjabi, was a main language, and often they didn't speak much English at all. And I thought, well, because the office would try to bring in some interpreters, and there was always some communication, and there was always delays in trying to figure that out, and interpretation budgets were pretty limited. And so I just volunteered, hey, I can communicate, and quite honestly, I'm not very fluent in Punjabi, but I was the best they had, and I got better over time, and then I've gotten worse over time since then, but. I just thought, okay, I'll start to do this, and it was my first experience really working in a sort of a social services sort of way, criminal justice supportive way with that particular population, and that's where I started to observe certain things. We were often getting male perpetrators of intimate partner violence, of South Asian background, Punjabi speaking primarily. And so I would start to work with them, and I was starting to kind of learn, and I knew already the way you're going to engage with somebody is through respectful dialogue. It's not about, despite the probation having a bit of a stick kind of thing where, if you don't do certain things, there's consequences. I still have always believed there's a way to do that, yet being respectful of the individual. And something I learned along the way as well is you can disrespect behaviors, or you can kind of disapprove of behaviors, but you still have to respect the individual, right? If you really truly want to affect change. And yet what I was often hearing was from victims who also were reaching out. And I also thought, wow, these are folks that are limited in language, so primarily Punjabi. They're contacting this person, a person from the criminal justice system. So it took a lot of courage for them to even reach out. And what they would often say is, this isn't what I wanted. Yes, I wanted him to stop being violent or using substances. But here we are a year later, and there's still court dates going on, and the kids are missing dad, and there's all these other folks' families that are kind of telling me to take the charges back, which she couldn't do. Of course, it's not in her hands; it's in the Crown Counsel's. But things that others would not know, their family and their extended family wouldn't know. And so just really starting to see that there was some dynamics at play that were really impacting these families, and so I had an opportunity so I have a bachelor's. I actually, at some point I decided, as much as I enjoy this work, I don't like the hierarchical system. I don't like the bureaucracy within the system. So that's my first shot at the system, and I'm going to take a lot more, so get used to those. But that one, was a bit of a struggle. But I also thought, wow, I wish I could work with folks before maybe they got to this place. Right? Maybe, there were often times where I felt like if the intervention had been available to them, they might have not necessarily got to the same, because there's often so much struggling that's happened and suffering that's happened, not just, like for the individual, but their families and extended families. And so I went back and did my master's in social work, and then left that position and did some work around counseling and work in nonprofits in counseling, and had an opportunity at around that time to do this research project with the JIBC. And I can pass this around. I do need this back, but this is available online if anybody wants to read it. It is a bit outdated now. It's from November 2011, and I can just... So you're welcome to take a look. On the cover, in case you're wondering, yes, that's me with hair. And that's my son. That's now 19 years old, and he just completed his first year at UBC. He was in Orchard Commons, and he's back home. And he's stressing about finding a place next year, as many folks may be in second year to find a place, but we'll hopefully get him through. We'll get him through. And so that research it was sort of my first experience of learning more about, so I had my own anecdotal observations over the years, and of the communities that I was working with in these South Asian communities. And so it was an opportunity to interview service providers who work with perpetrators of intimate partner violence, that are the South Asian male perpetrators, the victim service workers that work with the victims of violence, the social workers that often are part of Ministry for Children and Families that work with the children. There were community, agencies, people in management and leadership, so counselors, social workers, and then the men themselves, opportunities to run some focus groups. And I'll share some of the results, absolutely. But what I found was there was a great deal of interest. And even as I'm hearing folks talk about some of the research they're doing, I think it's fantastic. What I was hearing was, yes, this is something that's, and this was around, again, 2009, 2010. It was released in 2011, but a few years project. And unfortunately, it was a time when there was several domestic homicides within the South Asian community. And of course, by then, there's, the opportunity to intervene and save and protect victims has unfortunately passed. But it was prompted in many ways by those tragedies, right? Which again is another, issue I've had over the years, is too often we're dealing with things in a very reactive way. Like, things unfortunately have to get to a certain place, it seems, that before we start to kind of look at, okay, what is going on? These clusters of situations that can occur and often are very tragic. And so that sort of experience of the research, the experience I had, like I mentioned, all the different things I've done over the years, and I was also having the same experiences that some of you have, I'm sure, had or may have, and if you don't, that's wonderful if you can avoid those. But what I would often hear from, even as I moved into leadership and did things within nonprofit or even in government, is often, just that the needs outstrip the resources, that the needs of communities were so significant sometimes, but the services we were able to offer were sometimes limited. And so, and then there was wait lists, and then there was criteria for service, and then when you have, significant need, then your criteria starts to shrink in order to manage the need. And so it was a struggle I was having over the years. And I didn't quite know how to describe it until I went to a workshop years later, and it was perfectly described in terms of my experience, and it was that I was experiencing moral distress. I wasn't burning out, I still, and I've never necessarily burnt out. I don't think there's times I'm exhausted, absolutely, but it was the distress of knowing what my clients needed, but not necessarily being able to do it because of the job description and what I can do. Sometimes it's well out of my hands. I mean, like housing and affordability and food security and some of this, certain, of course, social determinants of health. But there were things I felt I could do, but because, again, the job description, I wasn't able to do it. And then the distress of if you're lucky enough, quote unquote, to even, to be eligible for a service, to be put on a wait list, right? And those kind of struggles. And, I went into nonprofits, and I was maybe a bit naive, and I don't want to jade anybody, and I think there's some good agencies back there. And, but what I did find with nonprofits is there's a lot of competition, and there's, it's not even, I don't blame them. There's a limit of funds, and it's, often agencies are pitted against each other, and often it's the lowest bidder wins. And that, I struggled with that as well, because I felt like, our mutual clients among different organizations could benefit from our integrated support and our collaborative efforts, but we weren't necessarily doing that for motivations that I felt were, I got them and I understood the rationale, but it just, again, I was experiencing this distress. And so I'm just on slide 1. So what I mean by staying on track. So then I've talked about my work experiences, and then some of the research here. The one on the right there is also something I could sort of hand out, and you're welcome to take a look at. And I could leave these actually for Rob if he wants copies of these. So kind of the bookend of my, and I'm by no means, a researcher or have been involved to a great extent, But, again, I started with that through the JIBC, the Justice Institute. And then more recently, I was part of a project with the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, which is based out in Ontario. And it was on this culturally adapted cognitive behavioral therapy. And so the manual TJ has, and these handouts folks can keep, they can keep a copy. I've got a lot of those. And so to be part of this project and to contribute as a community agency to, increase literature, to, to be able to reference literature in order to do the work that I think, we all want to do with our diverse communities, I think is important. So I'm always keen on working with different agencies. I'm always keen on being involved in research and supporting whatever research I can in whatever capacity I can, because I know that, anecdotally, there's only so much we can do. And so the more evidence we have, the more, the more we can reference in order to sort of to be able to do the work we need to do for our communities. So anyway, these are just some of the things I was able to do over the years. And so now I'll talk about, I think the way Rob set this up is really good, because I haven't really done clinical work in a while. I've done a lot of supervision and support, and I'll talk more about that, of students, practicum students on their master's programs. But I haven't done the direct clinical work. I still think I know a lot about what's going on in terms of the work with populations, because I care and I listen and I ask my counselors and social workers in terms of what are they observing and what are they seeing. So, and yet I still would not say that I know nearly as much as those that are working every day with these populations. And so, again, the research way back when, when I did it now 10 plus years ago, it was published. And then this more recent research, what I've kind of noticed is there's a lot of similarities. So in some ways, that's great that my research, I feel, back then still has some validity, or there's still a lot of the similar kinds of points. But then it's also a bit disheartening that, why are we still talking about the same issues 10 years? And then there's people that were talking about it well before I was, that were doing amazing work when I had the opportunity to do literature review. And, in some ways it's a bit disheartening. Is like, well, why do we continue to talk about a lot of these same subjects? And having said that, I do see progress, right? So I'll give the system a little bit of credit. There's progress. I find it slow. I find sometimes it's reactive. It happens way later than I wish it would, but progress ultimately is happening. So something I even remember when I started and I was starting to talk about the research and the results is I didn't want to contribute to stereotypes, and so I wanted to be very clear, and the evidence and the research showed that, and I think the more current one does as well, that, we're all very diverse, even amongst our own ethnic communities or our, faith communities, or our, any community that we see ourselves being part of or connected to. There's so much diversity within that. And so I didn't want to, when I started talking about these kinds of traits that may exist, I just wanted to make sure people don't think that, oh, okay, now every South Asian person is collectivist, and they're, they have a familial kind of lens and outlook, but just that this is something that may exist, and it's something to explore, and it's something to look at when you are doing, when you're, considering an intervention, that you are thinking about these different factors. So, within the research, it did, it's helpful to know that there are some commonalities among certain among South Asian communities. And then some of the factors that came out, through that research. And I could spend, I won't keep you here that long, but also, I could spend a lot of time on each of these subjects, because there was, not because I'm that particularly knowledgeable about it, but because it's just the rich dialogue, or the rich evidence that was coming through from all the interviews and from the literature, around these issues and these kind of considerations when working with, that we're working with these particular populations. So some factors to consider is just how, a client in your work. So this was working with the male perpetrators, but already it was kind of realized that you cannot just take the individual and isolate them and work with them. But often that's what our system does, so another shot. But that, to consider the the relationships that may also exist and may very much influence that person. So it's not just working with the individual, it is considering some of those other factors. It's considering, their own views, of course, and how those have formed around patriarchy, around gender roles. It was something, it was interesting to, and I think this is cross-cultural as well, like sometimes gender roles that exist within whatever cultural group. It's not just obviously limiting the, women and women identifying populations. It often was limiting the men, that they expected to be a certain way, that they needed to be stoic, that they, weren't maybe as involved in involved in child raising. It was actually limiting their, their own happiness, right? That they're not supposed to show emotions. And thankfully, again, there's been changes over time. But just again realizing it's the impact, and often when it came to the intervention, doing it of course in a respectful way, but kind of enabling the client to see how those expectations were actually not just limiting their partners, but it was limiting them. The way marriage was viewed, that came through clearly. Often I was seeing that just from my first year in Abbotsford as a probation officer, that often the clients coming to me, the South Asian males, were often married. They often had children. And when I would compare that to the quote-unquote mainstream population, sometimes it was dating relationships. Often there weren't kids involved. So there were different stakes, if you want to describe it like that. There was shared shared bank accounts and land. And so there was a lot of things that tied them together in ways that it maybe wasn't just so simple for them to separate. And of course, there were certain factors as well, and cultural factors that may have impacted them well. And there were times I thought, okay, yeah, like we probably don't want them to be together because it may not be safe, but that's not necessarily something they're considering, right? So just being aware, we were often imposing certain expectations on them that, it may have come from a place of let's keep them safe, but it often wasn't necessarily, just by keeping them separated, it wasn't necessarily doing that. Again, as I mentioned, folks, feel free to speak up at any point. Even as I'm reading this, I'm like, yeah, I haven't actually really thought of these things in a while because, I kind of dusted an old PowerPoint off and haven't thought about these things to the extent that I used to back when I would talk about this research. Just understanding the familialism, collectivism, how that may be emphasized more among South Asian populations, how it may be considered their experiences of marginalization, and the role in how substance use, often alcohol, is viewed, and how it's used within cultural communities. So these were factors to consider in an intervention. So within the research, we did talk a little bit more about some of the interventions and how it could be incorporated, but I'm not going to do that today. And then the concept that came up that many of you may be familiar with is this notion of intersectionality. That we can't just look at a South Asian male perpetrator. We can't just look at the victim. We can't just look at the children and isolate any one particular factor. We have to consider all these different factors and how they they sort of build upon each other and impact an individual rather than try to isolate and then try to intervene on any particular category. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, I figure, I'm kind of maybe preaching to the converted in some ways, but having said that, when I would talk about these things, I think I was still finding there was a lot of surprise. So, what became very common at some point, because I was talking about it often, it was still not something necessarily that a lot of folks had been exposed to and learned about, right? Some of these other factors, like we are very much, despite the efforts we talk about around decolonization and kind of looking at some of the individualism and some of the impacts of that way of doing things and those worldviews, that so much of it permeates the way we intervene, and certainly the way our systems are set up. This was a quote within the literature that always stuck out to me, and it was I think something that, during a time when we were hearing about these intimate partner homicides, or like as TJ mentioned, like the youth violence, like yes, these things are happening in these communities. They're happening in other communities as well, but sometimes how it was being framed, and again, there's progress, but I think it created a lot of defensiveness amongst communities. It created a lot of, feeling attacked at times, because it's this quote that that often when we would hear about these things, it would be reported in a way or viewed in a way like, what's wrong with this community? And it kind of, again, it created this defensiveness amongst the community. And, often sometimes, just like the work we do in interventions, when somebody feels attacked, they're often going to minimize or deny or deflect or even, go on the offensive to some degree. So I think that happened for a few years, where there were opportunities to have some really, respectful, impactful dialogue. But because of the way it was being framed as, what is wrong with this community, it led to a lot of resistance, and in many ways set some of the folks that were really looking to make an impact in these areas. It kind of set us back to some degree. So, all right. So now, how am I doing, Rob? I'm good. Still good. Okay. Oh yeah, no, I have to keep myself on track. All right, so now it's going to get even a little bit more negative, but eventually it'll get positive. Because going back to the research, again, a lot of pats on the back, frankly, for lack of a better term, like this is great, it's very much needed. But when it came to talking about changes, there was silence. When it came to, well, there's huge wait lists for services in first language, there's not enough resources for victims in first language or families, children, that we need to kind of increase training around cultural safety and cultural responsiveness. That some of this could be done without changes in funding, but just changes in how things are structured and done. It was silence in many ways. And that was disheartening, right? Because again, I was like, these are the same people that were patting me on the back, and now they're not returning my calls. And so that was disheartening. And I won't name names, even though I kept names. I didn't. But it was kind of these, like I did reach out to certain organizations, because they'd often talked about when these things were happening, they'd be out front and center saying we need to work together, we need to do more collaborative work, we need to do more integrated work. And yet, when the opportunity presented it, maybe I just wasn't the most pleasant person to work with. Maybe that's from. I don't think so, though. I was pretty easy, I think, and wanted to collaborate, right? And so I did, reach out to agencies. I said, look, there's ways we can do this. It wouldn't cost anything. What do you think? And again, there was silence. And so that was a bit disheartening, and it set me back a bit. And and then going back to the other experiences I was having around the moral distress of turning people away. So I was in an agency at the time doing clinical supervision and management as well. More management, but then I always drifted to supervision because I enjoyed it. I had great mentors when I was doing my Bachelors and Masters in social work, and it was something I was always wanting to do. And so when I had the opportunity, I took it. And so I was I was getting to a point where I was struggling with caseloads and who to assign clients to. And then I kind of looked at some of my students and I thought, wow, they're doing amazing, wonderful work. They come with such energy and enthusiasm. And what if I, instead of turning this person away or putting them on the wait list, I can just have them, the students see them, and it was often clients that weren't actually part of the funded programs. So I kind of had to quietly do it and not include it in my stats, because the funder doesn't want to know that you're serving people that don't meet the mandates. But I was willing to do that. But then I'm like, why am I having to hide this? Right? I just want to support these folks and not turn them away, recognizing how much courage it takes to even reach out for help, and how much harm has often taken place before they even reach out. And over time, I actually got to a point where I would look at a case and think, this is a complex case, but I actually think my student, would be the best suited to work with this person because of the skill sets, the fresh skill sets. And that's not a knock against people in the field. It's a knock against, again, the system. So if anyone's keeping track, that's 3 or 4. But it was, the lack of training opportunities, the lack of, keeping our folks fresh and well, given the complexity of cases they're dealing with. So I have nothing but empathy for those folks, and they were full caseloads and beyond. So I couldn't even necessarily assign some of the complex cases to them, but I was actually comfortable assigning it to students, with the right support, that they could do amazing work. And then over years, it was brought to my attention that there's a lot of great research that shows students with the right support and supervision can do amazingly impactful work. So, over time, all these things were coming together. I was actually also working on a doctorate where I was going to focus on community university engagement and the transformative potential of that concept to really do amazing community work. So that would have been the focus of my dissertation. At the time, I suffered some significant loss that I'm still working through and haven't had a chance to go back, but it's on my list. But so I always had that passion, in terms of community university engagement and in terms of students on practicum and what they can accomplish in terms of relationships with universities and, community-based research we can do, that doesn't always rely on, having to wait for a certain amount of funding to come through, which, we need more funded kind of positions. We need more funding for this kind of research, but it can often take a very, very, very long time. And in the meantime, I felt there was still a lot that could be done in a way that's not going to necessarily, cost. So, okay, so hopefully it all sounds a bit jumbled, but hopefully I can kind of bring it together. So all these experiences I was having in terms of the research project, in terms of my own work experiences, in terms of my own struggles of turning people away, I really settled on this, and that's where I started this agency called, and I'm not here to promote the agency because I don't need to. I don't have deliverables that I need to meet, but it was really a culmination of all these experiences, and it was really based on everything I mentioned, that there's a population. So in many ways, I wanted to support the South Asian population that was going underserved, but I also knew that there were so many other communities that were underserved, including the quote-unquote mainstream community. And something I often do say is, I'm not advocating that the system change for South Asian communities. I'm advocating that it changes for everybody, because it's not even working for the community that actually it was intended for, which is typically able-bodied white males, which themselves are a diverse population, that more so now than ever before, but it's not even working for that population, right? So so I don't just, although I still feel we should change systems for different communities, absolutely, in order to best support them, I also, again, have come full circle and say, the system needs to change for all communities. And again, I'm not going to sit here and say I figured it out by any means. I've just do something that, I saw a bit of a need, and I'm trying to do what I can in that regard. So this agency that I started, it was intended to have a wide open mandate. It was so anyone can access services, staying, in the realm of counseling and therapy, because I know there's a huge need for that. And the way we do that is through students. At any given time, we have about 150 to 200 students with us across the country. Okay, I skipped a few steps. Initially, it was just me, and me being pissy, I guess, but taking on some students and having this open mandate, knowing there was a huge need, based in Surrey, which is like the fastest growing city in the country, or pretty close, and has been for years. And so knowing there was certainly a need, and despite my sometimes coming off grumpy, I think I had really good relationships with a lot of different folks over the years that I've worked with. So when I had this idea of doing this and really having services delivered by the strengths of these fully supervised students, I had some great relationships. I had some space donated to me. I had these relationships with schools already established after having been a supervisor for years, and so started this agency and basically said, anyone that needs counseling, of course we're going to be very clear, and we're going to stay in our wheelhouse, and we're going to be transparent and ethical, of course, that this is the service and how it's provided, and then clients can decide. And the other part was we're not going to have a mandate So we're going to complement what other agencies do, what other, so if we can support the mandates of other agencies, if we can ease pressure off the traditional systems that offer publicly funded counseling but have huge wait lists, or, very specific service criteria, we will do that, or we will complement other agencies that do work around, homelessness outreach or food security, or, transition homes or recovery homes. So that's kind of where I've come to, and again, I enjoy it. It can be quite busy. Earlier today, I was mentioning to Rob, I was doing interviews for a study on interventions for South Asian males, primarily struggling with substance use, and it's often alcohol or opioids. And the lead is Dr. Natasha Puri, that's a faculty member at UBC, and she's an addictions MD. And so, that's exciting to be a community partner in that. There's this culturally adapted cognitive behavioral therapy for Canadians of South Asian origin. So that and frankly, we don't really have to do any of this. We do have some deliverables, I guess, over time, and as we've established, we've been able to get some funding. But I've intentionally kind of was not wanting funding for a while, just so we could have this open mandate and kind of work on and keep this kind of vision and not get too caught up in funding, not have to chase after funding. Okay, now it sounds like I'm promoting the agency, so that's not the point, right? But it was maybe recognizing some of the systemic issues. It was recognizing that, at some point, there's a lot of amazing people doing amazing work, but the systems aren't necessarily always the most conducive to doing that, that innovative work. These are some of the quotes. I do this little open house thing every other week or so. For interns that want to join me, and it's a chance for me to do what I did today, which is kind of ramble, but I like to share quotes, and these are some of the quotes that I think encapsulate what we're trying to do. That people don't lead single issue lives, and yet our systems are very much set up that way. If you're struggling with mental health, you go to adult mental health, or you go to child and youth mental health, or substance use, adult mental health. Sometimes they kind of work together, sometimes they don't, sometimes they're fractured. Right, and again, going back to the example, some of my first experiences in probation, where I would have this gentleman, and yet what I would dig a little deeper through my research, see that there was family dynamics at play, there was intergenerational traumas, there was mental health and substance use, and then our system would often say, okay, Dad, you go through criminal justice. Mom, you go through victim services. Kids, you go through the Ministry for Children and Families or through school district counseling. Again, all of them have different criteria for service. All of them have different wait lists. All of them are very effective in what they do, absolutely still, and there's amazing, wonderful people doing it. But I just struggled with the fact that the interventions, the way they were set up, I didn't think were as effective as they could be. And that was always a bit frustrating because, okay, a little bit more of a shot at corrections, because I would get these victims that say, I'd like to learn some of the things that the perpetrator's learning around healthy relationships. And, and I had a great manager, and I said, hey, this is what I'm hearing from them. And he's like, sounds great, but it's a hierarchical system, so we have to ask if we can provide that. And the response back was no. If they want service, they need to go to victim services. And that was, again, something that just never sat well with me, is that we have victims telling us what they want and what they're looking for. Victim services is amazing and necessary, but it's not necessarily about teaching healthy relationships and what those look like. And so that was a struggle. Like, we say that we're supporting victims, and yet we're actually telling them what they need, as opposed to listening to what they're asking us they need and what they're telling us they need. So anyway, the quote by Desmond Tutu, like, we are often reacting. We are, instead of trying to figure out and intervene earlier, our systems are very much set up. And again, I'm open to debating any of this, right? Because I've been on a roll lately. But that feeling like, too often the systems are only starting up when a significant amount of harm has happened. And that's, despite us knowing how valuable early intervention and prevention is, and again, I get it. If I'm on the government side, I would be having a whole different presentation. Pragmatically, yes, if you have limited resources, then you're going to put it towards the most, acute crisis-based kind of need. Yet the fatal flaw, I would say, to some degree with that system is then you're never going to get in front of any issue if you're always reacting, and again, the amount of harm that's been created as a result of that, so that was a struggle. And again, the way we, separate families to go do different I'm not saying that, advocating that, we bring an entire family together and work with them in the moment, because there's different dynamics and power dynamics and that kind of thing. But I wish we had a way they could all come together. One parent could see one person, one can see another, kids could see someone else, and then eventually when we all feel it's safe, that we could bring them together, right? Those kind of interventions. I've had wonderful school counselors, and for the life of me, and I've had some people kind of explain it to me, and it kind of makes sense, but I still wish they did less course change work and more social, emotional, therapeutic interventions. And I know it's different in different locations, but in my experience in Surrey, it's often been a bit limited in that regard. Some incredibly capable people who just aren't being utilized to and part of it again is lack of resources when they're stretched so thin, and so I get it, but at the same time, I think there's just so many missed opportunities. And then, the typical one, which was my experience when I did the research, was, I think the implied, you maybe have some good information here that I didn't create, but, this is how we kind of do things. It was never said that way, but anytime, reading between the lines when someone says, well, that's our policy, or that's our procedure, or that's our mandate, I just think, well, that wasn't created by somebody from up above, right? It could be changed, and it doesn't really take too much. It just takes the will to do so. But often it's kind of, it's the way we've done things is. And having said all that, there's been a lot of great things. So let's put that in context. The little asterisk at the end. There is change. Even when my kids would come home from school through the K-12 system and talk about the mindfulness that they did in PE. So these were things I never did, and I'm many generations in school, but so that is good, right? The fact that those things are happening, that they are learning more, there is curriculum in school, so there is progress. I don't want to say there isn't, but again, it tends to be fairly reactive after a lot of pressure is applied, and I wish it wasn't the case, because there's just so many missed opportunities. There's a lot of suffering, and so anyway, these were again things I've already described, so I didn't even follow my own PowerPoint, but just some of the issues I've had over the years. And I think, again, there's amazing people doing amazing work navigating these systems, but I'm going to keep pushing for some changes in advocacy, and it may not necessarily go anywhere, but I also feel emboldened and empowered enough to be able to continue to do so. In terms of looking at some of the systems where they tend to be more triage, that there is an emphasis, and again, I get it, pragmatically, short-term solution focus. When you have limited resources, you tend to look at, how do we get people in, get them as much support as we can, and move them on. And there's value to short-term solution focus, cognitive behavioral approaches, but I don't think it works for everybody, and I don't think it should be a one-size-fits-all. Again, when you have limited resources, you increasingly restrict who can access those. That to me is problematic, and bringing it back to South Asian communities who may not necessarily come forward in the same way, they may not present in the same way, and so it's already, they're already not necessarily we're open 9 to 5, come see us. I don't think that works for too many people, frankly, but certainly some communities it's not going to work much at all. You do have to find ways to reach out to them. But then I often think, well, what's the point of reaching out if all you're going to do is waitlist them or decline them anyway? So, that to me is, again, just sort of setting people up to fail, or just further deflating them and making them less likely to access services. The looking at things in a very individualistic way, the separation of mind and body, despite us obviously knowing that when you're suffering with socially, emotionally, it's going to impact your physical health, and then vice versa as well. The lack of integration, and then lack of linguistic, culturally responsive services. Again, it all sounds negative because, I don't mean it to be, because there has been a lot of good progress. There's a lot more collaboration. I think, what I encountered those years, many years ago, I think there are people coming up, but I almost feel like I still need to talk about that because I hope we don't continue to repeat those same patterns, right? And it's going to be the next sort of generations of folks coming through that, hopefully, the one thing, sorry, whenever I hear somebody say we need to, work collaboratively, I get a little pissy about that because it's like, no, if it was that simple, then we should have done that, right? Because we've been talking about it for so many years, and it still needs to be said. So I'm not saying that, and I probably have said that, but let's be honest and say, well, we have said this for so many years, so why is it still not happening? Let's look at systems. Let's look at the folks that can make. I don't advocate for anybody new in any field to start taking shots. But there's ways you can do that, right? You can question, okay, why do we do it this way, right? And if no one has any logical reason as to why a certain policy or procedure is done a certain way, or why it's not meeting the needs of diverse communities or Indigenous or BIPOC communities or LGBTQ plus communities, like, I think it's okay to start challenging those things, and we need to, right? There's ways to do it. Let me be the more aggressive one. You guys could do it in a more sly way. And so, if anybody is interested to learn more about the agency, again, it's not about promoting the agency, but I love what we are able to do. I love how we can be a bit of a, if somebody can't access a traditional public system because of wait lists or criteria, they can't afford private therapy, they don't have insurance, then, we can do something about it. And there's other agencies as well that are doing amazing work in that regard. And so, we are trending in the right direction for sure. And part of that, again, I guess it's just that I want to make sure that I'm walking the walk, talking the talk, that I'm not guilty of the same things that, I have brought up, over years. So I'm open to working with any agency, and, credit to the agencies that say, yes, let's work together. Let's put aside this notion that we have to compete against each other. Let's actually look out for the clients. And like I said, that's where maybe, again, systems don't care, but people do. There's people that get into this work because they genuinely want to help and support. Because if they didn't, you can get paid way better elsewhere doing, things that are way less mentally taxing. And so there's a lot of like-minded people. That's the part that excites me. That's the part that I'm inspired by. And that's what I want to continue to do, right? In the years that I have left in this field, is find ways we can work together. And related to that is, so this, anyone that's out in Surrey or wants to make their way out in a couple of weeks, something that I've noticed is there's a lot of great grassroots agencies out there, and I've connected with every single one of them there, and I think I'm in a good position where I've got some really good relationships, and others do as well. But, these are folks that are often just doing it just voluntarily or very limited funds. And so this was a nice sort of coincidence when Rob invited me, because these were things that we were working on, is how do we bring some of these groups together? So a lot of these groups are doing work for South Asian communities. They recognize a need. You don't need to know all of these, of course, but there's like a South Asian legal clinic up at the top. There's One Voice Canada that's really advocating for international students and doing amazing work. There's so many different agencies. There's ones around mental health, substance use. There's the Free Kitchen folks that do amazing work around food security. There's outreach around the opioid issue, like reaching out at places of worship. Again, amazing work. So if we can all just get together, talk over lunch, find ways we can collaborate, then I'm happy about that. And the one last shot at the system, there's no government. I've invited government, I put it out there, but I'm intentionally not asking them until we've got all the community agencies. Because something else I find a bit problematic at times, okay, I promise last shot, is, government, because it's the funder, tends to be the one that, and it's understandable again, they're the ones that coordinate, they're the ones that will often invite different agencies to a table, but sometimes it's a very small table, and it's often it's very limited in who they invite. And often these very small grassroots agencies aren't invited, and yet they're doing amazing work. And so there's an inherent imbalance in that kind of approach. They have way more funding, they have the ability to coordinate in ways, but then often they're in charge and they're the ones that kind of decide how things are done and who gets invited, as I said. So I'm looking at trying to do things differently, right? And there's others, so it's not just myself. But how can we do it in a truly grassroots way where it's community-based agencies that are connecting and deciding how we can, address some of the major issues that are affecting, in this case, South Asian communities. But a lot of these folks, obviously, it's about supporting anyone that needs it and finding ways to do that. So I think, just to sort of conclude, that's my, my goals, I guess, in the next while is how can I contribute, how I can not be a hypocrite and point out some of the systemic issues I've encountered over the years and, be part of that solution that I've been sort of advocating for and others have. And so then my last little quote here is just this one that, I do very much, I've always been inspired by that. It really doesn't take a whole lot of folks. I think often people do think, anytime we talk about this youth violence issue or domestic violence or homicides, it's like, well, it's just such a major issue that cuts across criminal justice and potentially mental health and education and health and so many other sort of potential sectors, right? But really, it just takes a few people that are wanting to do something about it. And if we can all sort of support each other and work collaboratively, I think there's some amazing things that can happen. I think that's the end of my ramble.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your talk here. I think Moving Forward Family Services is one of the best disruptor agencies I've ever come across.
Thank you.
Serving a really useful need for the people who can't access services in Vancouver and Surrey any other way. And I also want to put my appreciation because you let us partner with you as well, and we've offered some free substance use groups on Moving Forward Family Services in Surrey last year as well. So thank you for that. With that said, we'll open up if anybody has any questions or comments. Maybe just project your voice.
Yeah. I'm wondering what you see as the value of individual counseling. I mean, obviously there's variance in all groups, but like for South Asians as a whole, could you talk about the value of individual counseling for such a collectivist, family-focused, community-focused group?
That's a great question. And I'll open it up to others to answer as well. I still think there's, I'm a huge proponent of groups as well. And I think the value of both, and medication as well for those that need it and are struggling with depression or substance use where medication can be absolutely beneficial. And I think all of those combined are beneficial. So I see value in that. Like TJ does the groups that, there's value in groups where people can, and I've always felt that way, where if they...
One thing is very working with clients with substance use issues, especially South Asian Pacific. Actually, the Punjabi community, that was 95% of the clients that I worked with. Group was excellent, actually. Very psychoeducation, not too intense, some cognitive, some cognitive, was using some CBT, psychoeducation, but more about the relationship.
Yeah. So even like the value people, I think, when they realize that maybe they're not alone in their struggles, I find those are the benefits of group and the psychoeducation that you can do. That if you're trying to do that in an individual, it can sometimes come off a bit like you're lecturing them or and so it doesn't feel as, and sometimes they actually want you to lecture them. So it's kind of counter to what we know is a more effective way to work, which is it's a collaborative process. But at the same time, there are things that I know it exists, and it was prominent in the research around stigma. And so sometimes I don't want to talk about this in a larger group. So giving, again, the opportunity to have the group option and having the individual where you can talk about certain things that people may not want to talk about, like some of the intergenerational traumas or abuse they've experienced. So I see value in both, right? But also I think going back, like with the therapy, like recognizing, you know, and I was guilty of this, that if I'm going to, you know, explore family relationships, I'm not just going to think about and talk about who's in the household. I'm going to talk about maybe even the family member that's back in South Asia, back in India or Pakistan, that might have great influence on the family. So just understanding and being aware of that potential, but again, not stereotyping and assuming that's going to exist for everybody, but just expanding that way of thinking, like, are there others in your family that you, like, you know, doing a genogram and exploring those kinds of things. So yeah, I think there's, you know, and even this research on the culturally adapted cognitive behavioral therapy shows that CBT is absolutely appropriate and effective. It's just you have to use examples that resonate for the clients. If you're going to use examples that don't, then it's going to really take them out of the intervention, and they're not going to necessarily feel it is useful for them. They often will speak to you and say, yeah, that sounds great, but it may not resonate for them, and it may not stick because it's not necessarily. And I would hear that about, there's this program Maples does, Parent Connect, I think it's called. And it's a great program, and it is very much, it's effective cross-culturally. But even they acknowledged that sometimes, like, they needed to just adjust the examples they were giving. You know, like if you have an immigrant mom, you know, you may not bring up, the example could be like, okay, your daughter's dating somebody 2 years older than you. That was the example. And it was actually feedback from one of my therapists that did the training. It was like, yeah, most immigrant moms are not going to have this dialogue, nor will the daughter ever really bring that up to their, you know, like there's different ways to do it. It's not going to be as blatant as you're dating somebody. Like they still could be dating, but it's maybe, you know, quietly or covertly. And anyway, so it was those kind of things. Like, the actual concepts were very cross-cultural and useful, but it was the examples you have to be aware of, and yeah. So.
For clients who are, you know, are in relationships or marriages where there is emotional abuse, verbal abuse, those two especially, and they're wanting to stay in these marriages. Have you found that CBT has been helpful, or what has been helpful in those situations?
Again, anyone else's? I haven't looked at recent literature. I mean, I know that the consequence needs to stay, right? Like, often the reason somebody doesn't perpetrate violence again, and again, this is cross-cultural. Yes, some will recognize the harm it has on their partners or future partners or their children or even themselves, but often it's because if I do this again, I'm going to get arrested. And so the consequence still needs to be there. And I would never advocate for, if somebody, you know, commits assault or threatens, that is against the law and should be, you know, it should be prosecuted. But I also know, we've heard this again, and it may be older, but sometimes people become better at being more abusive once they go through some of those programs. Like, they stop using physical violence, but they learn that, well, I can actually be emotionally violent because that's actually not against the law. So anyway, that was a bit of a sad one. So it is, but it goes back to, again, if, you know, working respectfully with somebody, you know, maybe using motivational interviewing for them to see how those kind of behaviors have impacted them, seeing, you know, how their own worldview has been formed that may have been impacted by patriarchal and gender role kinds of viewpoints, and ideally they see the harm that it's done to them, right? But unfortunately, that's not going to be the case for everyone. But I mean, I still think, again, government loves CBT because it tends to be more structured. It can be more short term. Again, it makes sense from them in that perspective, and there is value to it. But then there's lots of proponents of other interventions like narrative and the psychodynamic, and you know, no one talks about psychodynamic anymore. I have a colleague that does, you know, and it's because it tends to be long term, and it's just not something that's going to be emphasized in a public system, or even in a private, like an EAP or like insurance, that's very limited. But those are all, you know, can be incredibly impactful interventions, and yet we also know it's the therapeutic relationship, and you know, what can come from that. So I'm not a huge fan of capping sessions, so we try not to, because you know, we want to make sure that that there's time for a therapeutic relationship to develop. Yeah.
Great. Okay, I know you have to get out to your son's.
Now suddenly I don't want to leave. I'm just.
I know you got to go to your son's concert all the way at Surrey, so I do appreciate yours. Give our kids a hand, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. I'll let the next speaker introduce herself, but I've also have known Elodie Sadu for quite a few years now.
Oh gosh,
Being
yeah.
two South Asian Indian psychologists, Punjabi psychologists in Lower Mainland, you tend to come across each other
Absolutely.
directly or indirectly in so many ways, where you see their names or you send clients, you know, they don't know you're sending clients. You know,
Exactly.
so I've known her for many years. We also sat together on the British Columbia Psychological Association Diversity Social Action. What's the name of the social
We
action?
called it Diversity and Social Action Committee.
So I sat
Yeah.
briefly together there, but I think she's just an excellent resource for counseling in the South Asian community. Sorry, so I'm very happy and delighted to turn you over. If she can give you any other introductions you would like.
Perfect. Thank you, Rob. Whoops. If I can figure this part out. All right. You know what? First of all, these are my haunting grounds, just so you know. I did my undergrad at UBC. I did then I did my teaching certificate at UBC. I was a high school teacher after that. But I knew I wanted to come back into counseling. And so then I did my master's degree at UBC when counseling psych was still called counseling psych and not educational and all of this other terminology. And then after being out in the field for 5 years as a school counselor, I got offered elementary and high school counseling jobs in Surrey when I graduated. And the person who was the head of services in Surrey at the time, we actually had a head of services for counseling, said, take the elementary. And I said, oh, okay, I'll take the elementary. And I was really glad that I did. I actually taught high school, but then I got to do elementary school counseling. And after 5 years in the field, I decided that the ceiling was too low, not financially, not in any way like that at all, but just in being in systems and not being able to do the depth of counseling that I wanted to be able to do. Students came to you if they were on a break, but if there was let's say a band practice going on or a concert going on, they would rather be there than in my office. And so at that time I decided I was going to come back and do my PhD, and did that right here in this building and the one next door. And so lots of wonderful, amazing memories from those times. Can you tell me a little bit about yourselves first? I'd really like to know who it is that I'm talking to.
Sure, I know you missed that.
Abundance of slides. And considering our time, I might say, let's just skim over this one. Okay? So the title of my talk is Counseling South Asian Indian Clients in Canada. So my knowledge base is based on all of the professional development I've done over the last, 33 years. As a school counselor and then as a psychologist. I've been a psychologist for 22 years now in private practice. So you had some questions about individual counseling. I think I'm going to be able to address some of those questions in the presentation that I have, but welcome to more questions afterwards as well. So based on my experience of working with youth in the school system and families and couples, and then moving into private practice and working with a lot of rehab-related clients through Workers' Compensation Board, motor vehicle accident-related clients, insurance company-related clients, as well as individuals who sought me for family counseling, individual counseling, and couples counseling as well. So I've done the whole gambit, really, in terms of lifespan, as well as issues as well. And I was fortunate enough to get 2 years of supervised training when I graduated from the PhD program with a group of psychologists who were focusing on rehab psychology and medical legal assessments. So I got that experience as well. Since COVID, I've focused more on telepsych, which is what a lot of psychologists did. And I'm one of the ones who's persisted and said, you know what, I'm sticking with this now because I'm at the other end of my career and I'm actually cutting down now. And there's so many psychologists and counselors out there who can do amazing jobs, so it's better that they see these people now. So I feel okay cutting down now. And honestly, when I first began, and some of you might experience this as well, when you see clients who really need help, and they're saying, I got nobody else to go to. You take them on, you alter your schedule to accommodate them. I've worked till 10 o'clock at night at times in those early years. I've worked weekends, I've worked after schools, I've done it all. And of course, it kind of gets to that point of boundary setting with regard to your own health and your own life. Are you only living the lives of the people that you're seeing? Or do you actually get to live a life of your own as well? And that's something I've really contemplated, I would say, over the last 10 years or so, because I've got children, I've got grown children now. And so finding that balance is really important. Now, see, that's one of the ways I go sidetrack on my talk. All right, so that's the title of my talk. And we'll start with an acknowledgement to the Musqueam First Nation, because this is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam. I don't have any financial relationship with any products or organizations mentioned in this presentation, and all the opinions are mine. Okay? Where I've borrowed ideas, I've tried to reference them as much as I possibly can. Regarding the first point, I was actually going to bring some literature, some references, except the author happens to be related to me, and I really contemplated back and forth, going, okay, is this going to be seen as some, I'm trying to promote something, but there, as Dr. Bedi will tell you, there's such a dearth of information out there that I think it is really important to bring forward whatever literature we can. So I'll give the reference to Dr. Bidley, but I did actually bring the books with me. And I think those books can give somebody who wants to work with South Asians, and particularly Indians and Punjabi Sikhs, some really in-depth understanding and knowledge. That can be a background, a foundation for working with that population. In terms of worldview, in terms of political factors, social emotional factors, family functioning, and spirituality, which seems to be really key to a majority of the individuals who come from India as well. So I'll give those references to Dr. Bedi afterwards. So what I'm hoping to do is I'm going to touch upon the DSM cultural formulation and cultural formulation interview, talk about the history of South Asians in Canada, and then counseling South Asian Indians. And I know I'm going to go over time with my slides, so Dr. Bedi, please stop me at any point. Okay, so the DSM-5, if any of you are not familiar with it, is a diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders. And page 749 to 759, they actually have a cultural formulation interview, which I have found really, really helpful. So even though I did my master's with a focus on multicultural counseling, and I did my PhD with an intersection of stress and coping and multicultural counseling, I still find it helpful. So I would really reference you to that as a great starting point. It doesn't matter what cultural, ethnic, racial background somebody comes from, it can be a great beginning point to figure out what kind of questions to ask individuals. Am I in your way? No? Okay. So it talks about the cultural identity of the individual, cultural conceptualization of distress, psychosocial stressors, and cultural features of vulnerability and resilience, cultural features of the relationship between the individual and the clinician, as well as an overall cultural assessment. A little bit more about that. It also talks about cultural concepts of distress, and the definition of that being the ways that cultural groups experience, understand, and communicate suffering, behavioral problems, or troubling thoughts and emotions. It also talks about what are cultural syndromes versus cultural idioms of distress and cultural explanations or perceived causes. When I look through the DSM-5, and we've got the DSM-5 TR now, but when I look through it, I don't see a lot of cultural syndromes that have been identified for South Asians. But certainly in terms of my experience of working with them for over 30 years now, cultural idioms of distress and cultural explanations or perceived causes are present in every single session, it seems, regardless of how acculturated somebody is, regardless of how many generations they've been here in Canada, regardless of their language of fluency. Because I flip back and forth with Punjabi and English with my clients. I wasn't able to when I first began 22 years ago. And there's a whole story about that. I won't go into it, but I felt very incompetent with the first Punjabi client I sat with, because it was a gentleman, so I was 22 years younger. And it was a gentleman who was about my age at the time, and a little bit older perhaps, lost his wife in a motor vehicle accident. And I sat there in this session and I didn't know what to say in Punjabi because I had learned Punjabi at home, but I call it kitchen Punjabi. So I knew my cooking terminologies, I knew how to communicate there, but I didn't know affect. I didn't understand professional language and how to use that. I'm happy to say I feel about 90% competent most of the time. And one of the things I think that's really important as therapists is curiosity. Curiosity and the willingness to be humble and to ask our clients, how do you say this? How do you say this in this other language? And honestly, I did that so much in those first, I would say 15 to 20 years. Whenever I didn't understand something, I would say, you know what, you're going to have to forgive me. I was 7 when I came here. And, you know, my Punjabi is not as good as your Punjabi is. Can you just help me understand how we would say this word or explain this in Punjabi? And most of the time, they were happy to be in that role of teaching me about something as well. And it increased my vocabulary, and here I am. The cultural formulation interview is a brief, semi-structured interview for systematically assessing cultural factors with clients. It talks about the individual's experience or asks about it, as well as the social context of their clinical problem. It uses a person-centered approach, and there's flexibility in terms of pausing when you want to pause with it, modify a question a little bit when you want to. So the purpose of it is to be a guide for a cultural assessment. But to make sure that you maintain rapport throughout, because that's what I find often when we have semi-structured interviews or interviews. It's easy to lose that rapport with the client and feel like you're being choppy. So the way I use it is I formulate it in the way that I want to. There's also an informant version, which is really helpful. So if there's other individuals within the client's family system, social network, school, they can also give feedback in terms of the issue. So it talks about, again, definition of the problem, cultural perceptions of cause, context, and support. Asks about, not talks about. Cultural factors affecting self-coping and past help-seeking. Cultural factors affecting current help-seeking. So if I'm in a situation where I'm in a bind and I don't know where to go with a particular client, prior to the session, I would go to this and say, okay, what am I going to ask? What am I going to try to understand? And how can I put it in a framework that my client is going to understand and respond to? So specifically focusing on counseling South Asians in Canada. So South Asia covers Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal, India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives. And some people actually put, some people put Myanmar, I think, is it Myanmar? Myanmar in South Asia, but others put Myanmar into Southeast Asia. So in the 2021 census, Canadian census, 2 million people, over 2 million people have reported that they belong to a South Asian descent. That's a lot of people out of our 36 million, I think, that we have now. So South Asian communities, this is really helpful and important as well. South Asian communities were also established in other countries with the British colonial times. So you have South Asian communities in Africa, Guyana, Trinidad, Tobago, Fiji, and Mauritius, as well as Britain, US, Europe, Germany, lots of other countries as well. So some people that have arrived in Canada have actually not come directly from South Asia and India. They've actually gone to other countries, been residents there for whatever period of time, and then come to Canada as well. So that is often helpful, I find, in my treatment and intervention. So just to give you some stats. So the latest stats, 2021 census, showed that India ranked number 1 with regard to top places of birth of immigrants. So from India, we had over 898,000 individuals who identified as being born in India. Pakistan, which is another country in South Asia, ranked 6th with about 234,000 in 2021. And a lot of times, I've lived in this country so long now, and I've seen so many census over time. A lot of times I find underreporting in census. So either the term that somebody wants to identify with is not on the census interview, And so they'll put other or they'll put something else. And so I don't think everybody actually gets captured. So the numbers are probably higher than that. With regard to top places of birth of recent migrants. Okay, so the recent migrants, India again is number one with over 246,000 people in 2021 saying that they were from India. With regard to non-official language spoken, most often at home. In 2021, Mandarin was number one, but Punjabi, which is an Indian language, was spoken by more than 395,000 people. And a large majority of them live either in BC in the Lower Mainland or they live in the Toronto area. There are pockets in Winnipeg, in Alberta, and now with the influx of international students, there are pockets actually throughout Eastern Canada as well as Yukon. I've actually heard of people moving all the way to the Yukon, which is fascinating as well. I get very fascinated. Another really interesting stat was in terms of first generation, second generation, and third generation or beyond. So with regard to population by generation, status, and median, so this is not just South Asians, but in general, with the Canadian stats, 26% of people said that they were first generation, so they were actually born abroad. So 26% of Canadians are saying that. 17.6% are saying that they're second generation, so they had at least one parent that was born abroad. And then over 56% are saying that they're third generation or more. So both their parents are born in Canada and they were actually also born in Canada. So South Asians share cultural, historical characteristics, but a lot of times they associate with their ethno-cultural roots. So understanding ethnicity, understanding culture, and how it impacts them becomes really salient with regard to assessment and treatment. So most South Asian Canadians were born in India, according to statistics. There's lots of languages in South Asia, in India. And so people, and also hundreds of discrete ethnic groups. There's multiple religions in India. Majority is Hindu, but there's also Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, Buddhists, Jains, and others. Pakistan and Bangladesh, majority is Muslim, but it is also very culturally diverse. Sri Lanka, Buddhism is the majority. Hindu, Christian, and Muslim are the minorities there. But we're focusing on India, but I thought you might be interested in a larger perspective as well, because I find that really helpful. Just again, in terms of background knowledge, Hinduism is over 2000 BCE, Judaism 1500, Buddhism 563, Christianity 1 CE, that's Common Era, Islam 570 CE, Sikhism 1469 CE, and Baha'i 1817 CE. So there's long traditions of spirituality, long traditions of religion and meaning making about life. And what I always say to my psychologist colleagues, whenever we talk about new approaches to therapy and new approaches to healing, my question to them always is, so what did people do 2,000 years ago? Like they either didn't have problems or they never got healed. Like what happened? You know, maybe there's other approaches that have already been tried that we need to, kind of go back to. So South Asian migration. So started after Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897, when South Asian soldiers who were going from India to the UK traveled through Canada and discovered what a beautiful country Canada was. And then 1902, when Edward VII was crowned, they also came through here as well. And they went, wow, what an amazing land. We want to go there. So the first South Asian migrants came in 1903. A majority of them were Punjabi Sikhs and males. And they'd heard about Canada from the British Indian troops in Hong Kong, which is very fascinating as well. But Canada didn't want them. So the majority Canadian government put together what they called a continuous immigration regulation and to try to prevent people from coming. But then there were some who challenged that notion, and you may have heard of the Kamagata Maru incident. There's lots of information about that. I'd really encourage you to find out a little bit more because it's a really key fundamental background piece to understanding South Asians. And their history in Canada. So that ship stayed in the harbor for 2 months, in Vancouver Harbor, and then was forced to return to Asia, and many of these individuals actually died. 1919, Canada allowed wives and children to join the Canadian men, and so the population was about 1,300 back in 1919. In 1947, the continuous journey provision was law up until this point and then was discontinued. And there were lots of other anti-South Asian legislations that were also discontinued after this. Now that seems to coincide with 1947 and the independence of India from the British Raj as well. And again, historically, in terms of working with individuals who come from India, Pakistan, northern India particularly, knowing about 1947 and how and the political tensions and how Pakistan was created from India and what the trauma was related, what the trauma connections were around that is really powerful. There's a wonderful a YouTube interview with actually a classmate of mine, her mom, who grew up north. I grew up north in central BC. It's an interview with her mom. It's in Punjabi, but they've tried to do a translation in English. And it's about her experience of having been a Muslim girl, age 13 or so, and people were being attacked left and right. She got separated from her family. She got rescued by this Sikh, S-I-K-H, gentleman. And eventually they ended up in Canada, lived in Williams Lake. She didn't know that any of her family members had survived. She did this interview about her experience, and her family actually found her. But before she could actually go and visit them in Pakistan, she passed away, but her daughter and her son actually went to Pakistan to visit the family. So really helpful in terms of understanding just the basics of that. There's lots of other information there as well. So from 1947, 2,100 South Asians to 2021, over 2 million in Canada. In 1972, all South Asians were expelled from Uganda. And so Canada accepted 7,000 of them. So we've got an influx of those individuals back in the 70s. We also had the Kenyans, Tanzanians, and Democratic Republic of Congo, who either came, individuals who came either through Britain or directly to Canada during that time period. In the 70s, we also had the migration of Fijians, Guyananians, individuals from Trinidad and Tobago and Mauritius, who also came to Canada. Again, these are individuals who are originally from South Asia, and a large part were from India, but they came through these other countries, so they have unique experiences as well. We didn't have as many migrants between 77 and 85 because our economy wasn't so great, but over the last, I would say 5 to 8 years, I've noticed a big influx of international students, a big influx of individuals who are here on work visas, individuals who are professionals in India, migrating to Canada on the point system and trying to establish themselves here. So the heterogeneity of the South Asian population is changing with on one end, you've got people who've been here and families who've been here for 100 years. My grandpa came here, my mom's grandpa, my great-grandpa, came here in the early 1900s, but he went on to California and stayed here for a couple of decades and then went back to India, and then the family came after that. So there's families like that who've been here for a long time, and then other families who are just coming now. So their issues, their concerns, their experiences may be different, and rural and urban is another really important point to remember as well. People who live in rural settings seem to have more in common, I find, versus people who live in urban settings, regardless of whether I'm talking about urban here, urban in the UK, urban in India. There's something about being urban. Education also seems to be a factor as well that can distinguish people in different ways. Family, cultural activities, religious institutions seem to be important for most, not everybody, but most South Asians. Extended families, kinship, community relationships with people from their village, people from their demographic region in Punjab, which is in northwest India. There's 3 distinct regions, and people say, well, are you from this region or that region or that region? And some people really, really strongly identify with that. Others don't. Varying levels of migration into Canada, as we said. Acculturation, ethnocentricity, religiosity, spirituality, English language skills, psychological mindedness, education level upon migration, and then rural or urban. Also, varying levels. This is where the psychoeducation component I find really becomes important. Varying levels of understanding of systems in BC and Canada, whatever system they may encounter. Financial stability can be an issue, independence, dependence from others, from family members, from children and their parents, grandparents. All of those issues can present themselves in the therapy session. Family variables, relationship stability, supports, local and international, as Gary was saying. So it's not about just asking people who's in your support system here, but are there people in your support system who are back home? Because some people actually call their family back home every single day, because that's their strongest emotional support or even financial support at times. Understanding about psychotherapy processes can also vary amongst people. So depending on what their level is, sometimes I find myself spending a lot of time in those early sessions talking about psychotherapy. What is psychotherapy? What is confidentiality? What are the exceptions to confidentiality? What are their roles and responsibilities as well with regard to that? And let's not forget, what somebody once said is that we are like every other person, every other human in some ways, like some other humans in some ways, and like no other human in some ways as well. And I think it was Maslow, if I recall correctly. So understanding that individuals can be very unique in some ways, but also have similarities. So what we want is a conceptualization, a framework in our head, going, okay, I think I know what I'm going to be dealing with, but then I'm going to weave in and out of this to understand uniquely where does this person fit in with all of these different variables. So strategies that I find helpful, empathy, active listening in those early sessions, normalizing their experience, psychoeducation about the Canadian context, Canadian laws, resources, psychotherapy process, confidentiality, exceptions. And that doesn't mean you have to do it with everybody, but if that seems relevant with that particular client. So, as I said, sometimes I do therapy only in English. Sometimes it's only in Punjabi. I can speak Hindi as well. I don't speak Urdu. Urdu kind of overlaps with Punjabi, so there's some similarities there. And by the way, Punjabi is spoken in Pakistan and it's spoken in Punjab, India as well. But there's some dissimilarity between them. And some clients I find want to weave between the two. And you know, in the early years, I used to be very surprised when somebody could speak English fluently, but in my session, they wanted to flip to Punjabi. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. So you want to talk about your real emotional experiences, your meaning making, how you exist in this universe, in this office. You want to express that through another language. Now that brings in interpreters, of course. So when we're working with interpreters, over time I've worked with interpreters, had good experiences and not so good experiences, not necessarily because of the skill of the interpreter. Sometimes it's been the skill. Sometimes it's because an interpreter has been called in, but they have a different dialect than the client. And I'm talking about clients in general, not just Punjabi or Indian clients. And sometimes they've been from a different group that has political tensions with the group that my client belongs to. And so all of those possibilities can happen. So it's really important if you're using an interpreter to ask your client, are you comfortable with this person? Is there anything about this person that is not supportive, is not helpful to this process that we're doing? Some individuals like to bring family members or community members into sessions, and I've had lots of varying experience with that. What I decided to do, I think many years ago, was open it up to this other person, if they were that important in my client's life, open it up for them to be present in the first part of our session, our first session, when we're talking about how and why they're there, because this person already typically knows, and we're talking about confidentiality, and if they're referred by a third party, we're talking about that third party. And then in that first little part, I set the groundwork, and I say, you know what, in order for this to be most helpful to you, one-on-one counseling will be really useful, because you'll be able to talk openly about whatever's going on without concern about what this other person is hearing, or whether they're making judgment of it or giving their input on it. And I found that with working with youth as well, because I've done lots of work with youth. Inviting parents in or guardians in at the beginning, if the youth wants that, and if the parent or guardian wants that as well, and then laying the groundworks and the boundary right there, and saying, okay, now I'm going to work with this person. And allowing the client to use non-English terms as appropriate, even if you're speaking English. If they bring up something in Punjabi, let them bring it up. Because oftentimes what I found is with young people, even though they're born and raised here, they might be referring to something mom said or something grandma said. And so what they have in their head is what that person actually said. So I allow them to say it in that way. Now, I can understand Punjabi, so I know what it means. But if you don't, or you don't understand the other language that they're speaking, just ask them. Say, okay, so now help me understand what that means. Talking about level, again, the similarities. A person with cognitive difficulty is a person with cognitive difficulty. And culture can be another layer on top of that. But understanding that somebody with brain injury might have more cognitive issues. So speaking in more abstract terms may not be as useful. Speaking in more concrete terms will be very helpful. And depending on how much formal education they have, that might be a variable as well. Level of social support. If they're marginalized in their family versus valued in the family. Psychosomatic symptoms. A lot of times stress can be expressed through physical tensions and physical aggravation of aches and pains. In my 22 years, I've worked lots with pain clients, worked lots with anxiety, depression, PTSD, trauma presentations. And so typically, I'll go after the anxiety, the mood, and everything else first. And then if something's still persisting, really try to dig into, is there something psychosomatic going on here as well? The therapist's role, by virtue of the therapist's professional training, life experience, professional experience, I find when they first come to therapy, my South Asian Indian clients, typically they've got me on this pedestal. And from this pedestal, we talk about what my role is. And we talk about the process of therapy. And so typically, not everybody, but typically, initially I might be their doctor. But as we move into therapy and they start trusting me more and they share inner experiences that they've never shared with anybody else at all, I become their guide, because I may have more experience with parenting. I may have more experience with understanding trauma experiences. I become their teacher and student. One client actually, so student in terms of having them help me understand what's going on for them or a particular experience, but their teacher with regard to helping them understand trauma, helping them understand depression, helping them understand anxiety or whatever, or pain management versus reduction, etc. For some, I have one client who calls me the one I just saw earlier today, and she's 30 years younger than me. The is shortened form of Didi, which means sister. And she's preferred to call me that for a long time. She's one of my longer term clients because she's got a permanent disability, and so I do supportive sessions with her. So I'm the. Initially in earlier years, I had all of these internal explorations about, okay, am I crossing boundaries here? Are they thinking I'm crossing boundaries? Is it okay for them to call me that? Is it not okay for them to call me that? But the culture is set up typically for most Indian cultures. We don't call people who are older than us by their name. And I remember struggling a lot with that when I was a young one, out in the workforce. And having to call somebody by their first name was like, what? No, I'm not allowed to do that. That's not the way I've been taught. I have to respect you. So they're like that as well. And I actually honestly used to do that too with my clients. Now I get to be totally white hair and, so I'm older, so I can be more like a mother figure and a grandmother figure, which is great. But when I was younger and I was more like a sister figure, to them. And if I knew that somebody was a few years older than me or even my age, and I would call them Mr. or Mrs. I wouldn't call them sister because I felt, occasionally I would, sister or brother. If I refer to their partner, I might say, how is sister, how is brother? But I typically didn't actually call them by their first names, because for me, it was another level of showing respect for them, that they have status even in my sessions. Whether I have a PhD or not, who cares? You still have status here. Preference for own culture or other cultural therapists, you might be curious about that, can depend on a lot of different factors. Again, minority, visible minority, non-visible minority. One is language needs and fluency. So that's a big one. Concerns about confidentiality within their own cultural group. So sometimes people will say, well, no, I know so-and-so, and I think they're going to go and share this. So they don't actually understand what the limits of confidentiality are that we practice in mental health. And so there's a psychoeducation component around that to help them understand, I will often say, you know what, I've been doing this job for 33 years now, and guess what? Nobody's story's gotten out, and I don't think I'm going to share yours now either. And so then they'll laugh and giggle and go, okay, 33 years, you haven't told anybody? Okay, I think I can trust you. Sometimes clients don't want to see somebody of their own culture for that particular reason, because they think that somebody will share their personal experiences or judge them, shame them. And so again, this whole psychoeducation component around therapy becomes really helpful. I've had clients who've seen somebody else who wasn't of the same ethnicity as me, but then later on said, you know what, I hit this roadblock. I need to see somebody of my own ethnicity. And I've done the same with my clients. So with my clients who are Asian, for example, I particularly am thinking of one, we did the work that we did, and then we kind of got to this roadblock, and I thought, no, I need somebody who really understands their context better than I understand their context. So gave him some references of names of psychologists who I thought could be really helpful. And he told me later, he said, thank you, that was really, really helpful. So it's okay to refer. It doesn't mean that we're incompetent. It means that we're recognizing that our clients have gotten to a particular point and there's more work to be done still, and there's other people who can help them more. Spirituality, level of spirituality, religiosity can vary as well. And so some of the helpful factors in terms of people from India, number one, spirituality is integrated into everybody's life in India. If you visit India, you'll see mandirs. Mandirs are Hindu temples. See mandirs, you'll see mosques, you'll see gurdwaras, which are Sikh places of worship, as well as other established places for exploring spirituality. So people are raised with it. And so those people who've migrated to Canada, a lot of them also have some connection to it. Not everybody. There are people who denounce it, and that's quite fine, but the point is to understand where your client is coming from and whether this is important to them or not, particularly with regard to healing. And what are their coping strategies? What did they used to do? So in rehab, where I see a lot of clients, what did they do before they had this injury? What did they do before they had this trauma? What were their normal practices before that? So if somebody says to me, well, I used to get up and do my prayers every single day. I did my prayers 2 times a day, 3 times a day. Now I don't feel like going and doing that. No, I'm curious. Interesting. I wonder why they don't want to do that anymore. And understanding after 33 years, I wonder if they're upset at their whatever the higher power is, because I've been a good person. And that's my phone telling me it's time. 1 second. Of course, it would be in the last spot you look, right? So understanding what kind of coping mechanisms they used, and whether spirituality was a way of coping, whether going to a place of worship was a way of coping, and whether bringing that back into their life would actually help them explore whatever problem is that's going on and move forward again and feel normal again. Racism, discrimination experiences, also important to understand. People like myself who grew up in the 70s in British Columbia, central BC, lots of racism, lots of discrimination at that time. Confidentiality and trust, we talked a little bit about that. So speaking to a stranger about one's personal family issues is not a value that we grow up with in India, or those of us who came to Canada from India. We're taught, keep your family issues to yourself. Don't tell anybody, because people will use that information against you. And so working with clients around confidentiality and helping them figure out who are trustworthy people in their network. Unfortunately, a lot of times, I still get from clients, there's nobody I have who I can 100% trust other than you and the other professionals I'm working with. Which becomes very sad, but it also talks about how we still need more resources out there in the community. Client-centered strategies can be very helpful. And an attitude. The attitude I always have is that the client is the expert on their life. I'm not an expert on their life. I may have more experiences working with trauma, working with anxiety, depression, etc. But they are the expert on their life. They are going to know what is really going to work and what is not going to work. So the goal with many clients is to help them gain insight and perspective into their beliefs, their wants, their needs, the situation, others' perspective as well, and particularly when I'm working with young people. So empathizing, understanding their worldview, the worldview of the young person. But then the next step becomes, and I think this is around young people in any culture, I don't think it really matters. If there's significant others and they're butting heads with significant others, to be able to step back and say, okay, I wonder what's going on for this other person in their interaction with you. And then using my own personal experiences of having been a parent, still a parent, and if they are a parent, bringing that in as well and say, let's just see, how do you feel as a parent about your child, even though your child may be young? What's going on there for you? Expectations of clients. So some people just want insight-oriented approaches and cultural understandings that they feel that they may or may not have already. So I find a psychoeducational component, a willingness to challenge my clients to think beyond whatever box they've put themselves in. To say, is there another way of looking at this? Is there another way? Validating experiences, bicultural, multicultural experiences, helping them negotiate living in multiple cultures. Sometimes the culture of the home, the culture of the school can be very different. And helping them figure out how do you work with both. Directiveness, I kind of move between the two. When I'm doing psychoeducation and working with depression, and the research tells me that to help a depressed person, the behavioral strategies are more important than the cognitive strategies, I'm directing. Saying, you know what, you really need to have some structure every single day. We really need to teach you some sleep management strategies. And this is going to be really helpful. Occasionally, at times, if I'm really trying to be convincing, I will say to them, you know what, if you were my younger brother or sister, I would say the same thing. I wouldn't tell you anything different. And somehow that seems to win them over and help them understand that you really, you are being genuine. You're not just being this person that they were referred to, this person out there, that you have their best interest in mind. Because remember, in their worldview, their siblings, their family has their best interest in mind. So again, psychoeducation, insomnia, low mood, anxiety, post-traumatic symptoms. There's a lot of psychoeducation that I do around that. How do we define what is stressful or traumatic can also vary. I'm going to jump now. Okay. So again, if somebody says something was traumatic to them, instead of judging, well, you know what, that really isn't traumatic, going at it from their worldview in terms of help me understand what this problem means to you. Help me understand what you expected and why things are the way they are. Help me understand how you would cope with this. Who are the individuals or people or resources that you would access to help you figure this out? And sometimes it's spiritual issues, sometimes it's non-spiritual issues. So trying to understand where the client's coming from. Client-centered approaches I find really helpful in order to engage my client. Systems understanding, really, really important because context, families, social relationships are typically important for people from the Indian subcontinent. Allow clients to progress at their own pace, and I know Gary alluded to this as well. CBT, we've got our structured approach, and it's 12 sessions. Gosh, the number of insurance companies I've had to say, I am not taking the client if you're just giving me 12 sessions. Sorry, you find somebody else who will do it. And then after about 3 years, I actually did that. And then after about 3 years going, oh man, Who are they going to go to? There's a limited number of us. So then I got to this point where I said, okay, even if somebody's referred for 4 sessions, I'm going to do my best with those 4 sessions. And I say that to my client as well. I think you need much more than this to address whatever's going on. But let's just go with the 4, and then we'll ask for more. And then we'll ask for more. And then I bring the whole spiritual notion in, and I say, you know what? Yeah, there's a bigger picture that you believe in, right? Because I've already, assessed my client. So you believe in this bigger picture that there's this higher power that's in charge of everything. Okay, well then, if 4 is all we're going to get, then 4 is all we're going to get. But you know what? If we're going to get more, we're actually going to get more. So let's just work with the 4 that we got right now. Use more behavioral concrete strategies, again, with people who might have limited education, people who are more focused on the medical model of distress, people who might have cognitive limitations. Incorporate meaning making and spirituality is appropriate for the client's identity. So I'm very, very aware of what the Western guidelines of my college are. I'm very aware of them in terms of religion, spirituality, and bringing it into sessions or not bringing it into sessions. So I actually say that to my clients. According to the way I have been trained in the West here, I'm not supposed to be bringing this in, but I recognize that this is important to you. Do I have your permission to bring this in? And so often they'll say, yeah, this is important to me. Okay, let's talk about it. And then later on in sessions, I may bring that in again. Meaning-making spirituality as appropriate for client's identity, using stories, examples of how others coped versus. So this is where I find knowledge, actual knowledge about their spiritual perspective, their cultural perspective, stories, narratives that they can connect with, become really, really important. And so with, let's say with SICH clients, SIKH clients, there's lots of stories around how people overcame pain, physical pain, because they had this connection to a higher power. And so for pain management, sometimes I'll use that and I'll say, you remember the story of so-and-so? They'll say, yeah. Well, I know we are not that person, because if I say that we're equivalent, then of course they're going to come back at me. We're not that person, but if they could do it, that means our human body has the capacity to do it. So why don't we try these other strategies and see if they're actually going to be helpful? Bringing in experiential strategies over the years have been really helpful. Role playing, so if they're having an interpersonal issue, getting them to role play it out. Using empty chair, 2-chair techniques to help them further understand where they may be conflicted about an issue or not have sufficient insight into an issue. Uses of universal and culturally and spiritually relevant metaphors and imagery, and then I'm going to stop after these 2 slides. These are common analogies I find really helpful, that I find it doesn't matter where my client is from, often they understand these things because they can connect to it. So using a teapot or a coffee pot as an analogy for self-care, so that you can fill a coffee pot or teapot, you can keep giving to all these other people, the cups representing all these other people, but at some point, what happens? It becomes empty. So what do we need to do? We can either wait for it to become empty and then fill it up, or we can wait for the pauses of people needing the tea or coffee and refill ourselves. So I talk about self-care in that context. Talking about baby steps. Everybody was a baby once. People have babies in every culture, so they can understand how challenging it can be when you're a baby to take those steps. You fall, you get up, you fall, you get up, but you don't just fall and stay there, because you never learn to walk. You never learn to crawl. So they can connect to that as well. Using the airplane analogy or metaphor, because if they're a migrant and a recent migrant, they typically came on a plane nowadays, not on the boat, as we used to say, off the boat a long time ago. So off the plane. So they've heard that spiel given to them by the crew on the plane, where they were told, if there's an emergency, put your mask on first. And so I use that with connection to self-care as well. Being in quicksand, so using whatever kind of metaphors with that, but quicksand, meaning that when you're drowning, and there's something that's there that might actually stabilize you, it really doesn't matter if it's a stick or an oar or a boat or anything. It doesn't matter what it is. You just need to get out of that quicksand. And so I've used that often with people who, let's say, had an injury from a vocation and then trying to get them back with some sense of hope. I'll say, you just need to hold on to anything that's going to move you forward. Anything. Start with your structure, your routine, eating healthy, sleep management strategies, whatever you can that's going to move you forward, and that'll help. Another one I often use is take the initial steps, just get to that door, because we really don't know what's on the other side of the door. We may think we know what's on the other side, but our perspective is going to be totally different once we get to that door. And so that can be really helpful in terms of moving them forward as well. And boulders in your path, people typically understand that one as well. You're walking along, there's a big boulder in your path, how do you get around it? That's the problem. So you can go around it, under it, over it, or if you really, really must, you can get through it. But that'll take you a lot longer. And then concepts, the only sure thing in life is death. And there's an Indian concept that we're given a certain number of breaths in life, and that once those breaths are finished, then we go into transmigration. A lot of Indians believe in transmigration, which means there's life after this life. And so with grief and coping, that can be really helpful. Concept of Chardikala, this is a Sikh, S-I-K-H term. Chardikala means optimism, positive. And so if they connect to spirituality already, bringing forth that concept and say, what does that mean to you? What would it look like in your life if you were practicing Chardikala? Scripture references can be helpful, verses, but ask them, are there any verses that you feel connected to? And again, this doesn't matter what spiritual, religious background they come from. I've worked with so many diverse individuals and backgrounds. They connect to that. Are there any verses that are important to you? Life is a series of tests and challenges versus being punished. So with the concepts of karma, kismet, sometimes people have taken that to mean that I'm being punished for my past actions. And so depending on their spiritual orientation, religious orientation, I'll ask them for examples of that. Is there anything in your scriptures that says you're being punished? And because I know Sikhism really well, I'll say, well, actually, I've read the scriptures. There's nothing in it that says you're being punished. It says that this higher power is your lover, is your friend, is your mother, your father. It doesn't say you're being punished. So how could whatever you're experiencing be punishment? And then other concepts such as Nam Japana, Vanshakana, Kirtkarni, which are really important in Sikhism, which is to meditate regularly, to share of yourself with others in whatever form, and to do honest labor. Another, and I'm going to finish here. If you folks want copies of my further slides, I'm very happy to share them, not a problem at all. So general questions one could ask about communication style, about specific circumstances, depending on their presenting problem, if they're married, if they're single, if LGBTQ. For Sikh clients, a particular verse that can be really, really helpful to fall back on in terms of death, dying, meaning making in life, and then some other concepts around that. And then really trying to understand who is coming to your office, what are they coming for, where are they coming, when are they coming? Are they coming in crisis? Are they coming for prevention, remediation? How are they coming? Are they coming alone with somebody else? And why? Are they coming voluntarily, involuntarily? And then some specific brainstorming that I did around if it's a refugee client, what might be some of the factors? If they're international students, if they're professionals on the point system to Canada, if they're first generation youth, migrant or first generation adults, and then elderly. So I think that was it. And again, remembering every one of us is like every other person, like some people and like no other. And in my office, I'm trying to figure those three pieces out at all times. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sadhu. I'd love to open it up to a few questions.
Yeah.
Comments?
Yes, sir.
This is a very practical question.
Yeah.
But you mentioned, or I forget what you mentioned, do you work with interpretation services?
I have in the past. In Punjabi, I didn't need to because I could speak Punjabi, but I have with individuals who spoke other languages.
And when there are challenges with what are some ways that you're still able to work with that client? I'm just thinking back to our experience at the crisis center. The interpretation service that we hire is often questionably helpful, and so it just made me think about what alternatives in those moments.
I guess, well, it depends on whether you're in the moment and you're having to deal with the client then. My worst case scenario was I had a client self-harm himself with the interpreter present, and I'm calling the police and I'm saying to the interpreter, what's he saying? What's he saying? And he says, he's saying don't call the police. I'm like, what? Oh no, because I can't communicate directly with this person to help them down-regulate at all in that situation. So I think, but in that situation, the person didn't have trust of systems and was referred by a third party. And so honestly, I actually stopped using interpreters after that. And if somebody needed interpretation, I just said, I'm sure there's somebody else who can do this job better than I can. So got me to that point. But I would explore individuals in that person's network. Or if there's community services of some other kind, where there's volunteers. Again, confidentiality is very important though. You have to make sure that that person is going to keep confidence. And of course, accuracy of interpretation is always important as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz. I really enjoyed this and learned a lot. I was wondering if maybe you could speak a little bit to anything that you might have noticed of significance or any differences between clients who came to Canada primarily because there's something in Canada that they were drawn to. So if it may be school or a relationship or anything but the focus was more to experience something here versus clients who their main thing is that they were trying to get away from some sort of circumstance in India or another.
I can't think of examples offhand, but just to think about that notion. So somebody who's running away from something may have issues around confidentiality, may have issues around distrust of people, may have trauma experiences that may need to be explored, but is wanting to be here. So they're probably going to try to do whatever they can to stay here. So I think those factors would be really important in terms of helping them understand what's going on within the system, where are the resources, where they can turn to, versus somebody who came to be here with somebody. I imagine there might be more interpersonal things going on, whether the expectations that they had with regard to that job or that person have been fulfilled, have not been fulfilled. If it's work-related stuff, for example, again, psychoeducational component in terms of what are your rights as a worker, what are the obligations of the employer. If it's a relationship issue, what are your rights as an individual here in BC and in Canada versus what they might have been back there. What are resources? Where can you connect with people within your own community if that's what you're needing to? And often places of worship are places that people can go to if they identify with any particular with a religion or spiritual perspective.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, yeah.
I'm very curious about, because I largely, the context that I operate in is I mostly see upper to middle class clients in India, which are largely urban. So I have a lot of similarity with them with regard to education levels and socioeconomic class, and even the worldview. So I know that when we look at South Asians or Indians in particular, there's a lot of collectivism. But what I'm finding in my practice is that I share we're not completely collectivist and we're not completely individualist. We're somewhere in between right now.
Yeah.
It's a very, very fast evolving society.
Yeah.
And so in my practice, I find that when I'm able to situate the person in their context, it helps me understand them better and helps my work with them.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm very curious as to, so there are two parts to my question. One is there a difference between first generation, second generation, or third generation, Indian Canadians who come to therapy, and is there a difference in their worldview with regard to collectivism and individualism? And two, how do you do you pointedly directly inquire for that, or does that Does that, how do you elicit that?
So a couple of things. One is the urban-rural thing, definitely. I think there's cross-cultural similarities in that, for sure. I've also noticed when I haven't gone to India a lot, but the times I've gone to India, people who are professionals seem to migrate all over India.
Yeah.
Right? And their children migrate all over India. So that notion of career, that notion of going after a job and staying apart, couples staying apart, families staying apart, children staying apart from their parents, in some ways they've progressed further than some of the people who migrated here 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So I think situating the person is really, really important. And I think the one question is, how important is your family? How involved are they in your decision making? Do you make your decisions independently? Who do you access to make any important decisions in your life? And they may say, well, I make my own decisions. Well, there you go. Now you know that whatever problem they're having, they're going to be they're going to be more in control of their lives. They're going to be less concerned and worried about other people. But that doesn't necessarily mean zero concern. That concern can also be in different layers, can't it? Right? So they may still have a sense of obligation to parents back home in India who they send money to.
Yeah.
Right? Or who they want to bring abroad to Canada. So there can still be those kind of connections. Whether I ask directly or indirectly, a lot of times I'm just eliciting it with general understandings about what their issue is, what their problem is, and I'm situating them in my mind. You know, with regard to that whole history I gave you about South Asians, those that came early, those that came later, those that are new migrants, and then seeing the diversity amongst migrants, I'm situating them at all times. I'm situating them in terms of religiosity, in terms of spirituality, by are they wearing are they practicing Sikhs? Are they not practicing Sikhs? Are they practicing Hindus? Are they practicing Muslims? Are they practicing Buddhists or Jains or whatever it is? And so I look for signs and clues about what this person, who this person is, how they're talking about themselves, how they're talking about their migration to Canada, whether it was a decision that they made, whether it was a decision that was jointly made by others. I'm also listening to their stories about relationship, and if they're married, how they came to be married. Did the family have any role to play in that? Or was that something that was their own independent choice? Which then can also go back into, is a family going to be a source of support if you run into any problems? Right? Versus, I made this choice on my own now. My family's going to say, well, you sowed your seed, so, there you go. You got to reap the rewards of whatever happened. Does that answer it? Yeah? Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr.
Thank
Savio,
you.
and I express my appreciation for coming here and talking to my cross-cultural counseling class, and I know they gained a lot. Okay, so let me introduce our next speaker, Mr. Tadinder Gill, TJ for short.
Yeah.
I met TJ maybe several years ago when he was delivering a Punjabi language dictions group for men at a nonprofit in Surrey. And so that's how I came about meeting him, and I started working with a nonprofit to deliver some culturally adapted services and program evaluation. And as he moved forward, he moved on, we kind of kept in touch. But I think he's a very well respected counselor in the Asian community, locally for the South Asian community. I'll turn it over to him so he can introduce you to all the great work that he does, like his drinking driving program and everything else. So go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, hey, thank you for giving me a chance. I'm not usually a good presenting stuff with a computer. I usually do everything with a pen on the board. I'm a little bit old school. So I've been doing this so my full name is Tajinder Singh Gill. I keep Singh in the middle, for that just identifies my cultural Punjabi, being a Sikh. And so I've had many nicknames in the community. People call me TJ for short. I used to be called Taz when I worked in a treatment center, like Tasmanian Devil. She called me Taj Mahal before too. Because I've been working, I'm 47 now, so I've been working in this field for about 26 years, since the age of 21. So I worked with probably about 3,000 participants. So my background's quite interesting. So currently I work as a coordinator for a gang intervention program. It's run by Options Community Services in Surrey. We specialize working with youth and families of a South Asian background. It's funded by the Surrey Anti-Gang Empowerment, that program. So the City of Surrey is funded by the National Crime Prevention Strategy. So I do that, and I also teach people get caught drinking and driving. sponsored drivers program. So I teach that in Punjabi and also in English. So with my background, I've been doing about 26 years. I have a criminology background, crim. I was going to go into policing, but I decided not to because many of my friends that I grew up with were involved in, I guess you want to call low-level crime, gangsterism. I don't drop names, but I've had probably about 120 of my friends were murdered in gang violence in the 1990s and 2000s. What Gary talked about earlier is still going on today. And I'm also certified as alcohol drug counselor. I could work anywhere in the world for addictions. And I'm also a treasurer for the Canadian Addiction Counselors Certification Federation, the first South Asian person to be on the board. And I also helped develop the exam in 2017 if you want to become certified to be an alcohol drug counselor in Canada. So that was like one of my pet things. Yeah, I've also worked in corrections as a youth correction officer. And part of my background is I've worked in residential for about 15 years when I was younger. If you want to get some good experience, work with young people is the best way to go. Work with adults is easier than work with young people. That's my personal view. So I worked in group homes and also worked in a residential treatment center for the Salvation Army in the late 1990s. Canada, for BC, where they took young people from all over British Columbia. Instead of being in the custody center, they would serve their time at the treatment center. And what was really interesting about that was many of those young men that I worked with actually went on to become gang members or founding members of the current street gangs you see. So I worked with about 34 youth who went on to graduate and actually did a murder. So I worked with some of those dangerous young people. And sometimes I run into them on the streets. She would say, "Hey, how you doing?" We have a good conversation. And currently, right now, we work with some pretty high risk people. Actually, get them out of the gang life and preventing them from actually being killed the last 4 or 5 years while I've been working this program. That's a little bit of my background. So what I've been working with the South Asian community is mostly from the Punjab. So we worked with some people from India as well. So in the Punjab, it's a state in India for Sikhs. And I worked with probably about a couple of thousand people. And they're all immigrants that came here and settled in Canada. And one thing is when I worked with them, so when you work with any type of immigrant person that walks through our door, that's a very powerful and very amazing, because many of them don't do that. They keep it very hidden. When you walk through the door, they're looking for support and services, and they're reaching out. And most of the time, the services, they don't speak the language of English, and most are mainstream non-profit community services they come into. And sometimes, what we'll do the Sikh community is immigrants from Punjab or India or Pakistan, they'll call like a counseling session, they'll call it a class. Like you're the teacher. That's how they break it down. So when someone says that to you, don't be offended by that. They're saying, I'm here to take a class with counselor so-and-so, right? And it's very unique, very basic, because it's very stigmatized in the community for many cultural backgrounds. Like I work in Surrey. If you ever go to Guildford Mall, it's like you're in a different type of time zone, because there's so many people from different cultural, different backgrounds, the way they dress, the way they clothes, and also the way they talk. It's quite fascinating because Surrey is growing very, very. I call it the multicultural capital of Canada. That's my personal opinion, because when I go to Guildford Mall, I'm quite amazed at, kind of lost by such great diverse backgrounds, right? And what you see when they walk through the door, they're looking for help and support, and sometimes people kind of mistreat them. The main entry, when they walk into your building, when they say hello, they're looking for a response back. They're looking for someone to give them help and support in their language. That's a big key, right? And that's one part. With the South Asian community, working with immigrant population, very unique. I worked with men, usually ages of 25 to 65, and they're usually mandated. Mandated means they're sent by probation, usually for drinking and driving, or mostly for domestic violence. They're sent by their PO because they had to do a condition of had to do alcohol drug counseling because they had committed a violent act while under influence of alcohol. And most of them usually came from a letter. Like they want to get a letter to go to court so that they can show it to court or show it to their probation officer, the completed services. So when I started working in my early 20s, they would come in, we'd ask all the questions, we'd ask them like, hey, when did you first drink? They said they drank in Canada. They never drank specifically back home with the Punjab. The reason that was because when they grew up, they don't pay taxes, right? And also, community is very close. The families all live together. The family, 15, 20 people live around the village, very close by. And also, a lot of them worked in the agriculture sector. They have their land very close to the indigenous community. They're connected to the land, to the farm. So when I'd ask them, like, how come you drank in Canada? I came here. Within 3 days, I got to start finding a job and start working. A lot of pressure. Got to send money back home. And also, they got to be economically successful. Most of these clients I worked with, they usually own 2 or 3 houses. They worked 16 hours a day. They had a business. Their physical health was good. The mental, emotional health was a little bit down because a lot of trauma. But we noticed over the last 20 years, more and more trauma-informed practices come in. Back then it wasn't. And they all had a family. Their education was pretty low because most of them didn't go to school. They went to basic grade 8, then they started working in the farms. And employment was excellent. Criminal justice system was poor. Most of them all came from the criminal justice system. Our program was very unique, which we ran because I used to work Monday to Friday. 9 to 5 doesn't work for any cultural background. Usually evening time and weekends. So I used to work usually work a couple of days, works like 8 p.m. I used to work on Sundays. So for 10 years, I probably took 4 Sundays off. Father's Day or just having a vacation day, like a wedding or something. So I worked on Sundays, and we used to have about 20 to 25 men come in. 3:30 p.m. We always kept the group at 3:30 because majority of the men that I worked with, they all had a job, Monday through Saturday. They would usually work from 7 a.m. to about 6 p.m. and they all drank in the evening time. We drink average. You guys know what a standard drink is in Canada here? 1 ounce or 1.5 ounces, you want to call it, right? So in the community I come from, it's free pour. Free pour means the bigger the glass, the more you put in. Average drink is about 4 ounces, 3 ounces. It's called a patala peg. That's what it is. It's called a peg or patala peg. You'll hear that. And nobody measures it. In our community, if you measure it, people think you're cheap or you're disrespecting them. So alcohol is very easily flowing. Have you guys all been to a South Asian wedding or reception? Alcohol is served. I've gone to many Caucasian weddings where you buy alcohol or you got to buy for a beer thing. In our culture, it looks down upon. And so they would free pour, and they would all, usually the average guy would drink about a Mickey a day. That's the standard they have in our culture. A lot of these guys we worked with, they drink a Mickey a day or a half a Mickey. So they come in, they pour a shot, about 3 ounces, take a drink, go take a shower, come back, another 3 ounces, have another drink, then they go to bed. Or some of that traditional, when I was younger, my dad used to work in a mill. A lot of the guys would drink on weekends. They couldn't drink, they wouldn't drink Sunday to Thursday because they had to work. But they make up the quota on Friday and Saturdays. Like a weekend drinker. And when you're working with these clients, sometimes everything you might learn here today, you kind of throw out the window. It's all about building a relationship with someone. The biggest thing in a relationship, your tone of voice, the way you speak to them. And it's usually the first time someone who's coming from a minority background is going for help. It's the first time they've actually reached out for help outside their family. So that's very brave. It takes a long toll to do that. And you can be very successful in doing deliveries with them. It's how you approach them. You ask them how you doing, sit down. You tell them that, hey, sometimes they'll call me a doctor. I have to correct them, hey, I'm not a doctor. I'm just a regular person. I have a drug and alcohol background. And they just open up to you. And the first time they open up to you, and you'll be quite amazed when they open up to you and talk to you. You ask them how you feel. And they go, I didn't know that this is what counseling's about. I'm like, yeah, you come in, talk about your emotions, your feelings. You talk about whatever you want. And they're very respectful. Like Dr. Sidhu had mentioned earlier, they used to have a nickname for me. They used to call me Gilsob. That was my nickname. They wouldn't say my full name. They called me Gilsob. Like, it's important. I used to like that name. I still get called in the streets once in a while. And privacy is very important. Like many of the clients I worked with, I wouldn't actually speak to them on the street unless they came and talked to me because I respect the privacy, right? And the thing is, so that was the main thing. A lot of them would drink because of stress. They didn't know how to do it because the Western culture is so different than other cultures in the world. It's fast-paced. And a lot of them drink for stress or family problems, or they don't know how to deal with their emotions. And what they would say is, hey, I've never done drugs like heroin, smack, opiates, crystal meth, cocaine. Never done don't smoke. all they do is just drink. That's how they justify it. I don't do all that stuff. Alcohol's not a big thing. Alcohol's good for you. And also, they don't allow people, like, I was telling them, like, hey, well, do you drink one glass of wine? They're like, no. I'm like, in our culture, free pour, that's how it usually works, right? So you break a lot of the barriers. So we meet with them. And we also did, like what Gary had talked about earlier, was that when I did the groups, a lot of these guys will relate to each other because drinking was a thing, but a lot of them had a lot of emotions, a lot of emotional issues, and also a lot of trauma, I noticed. We did group because we were funded by the government, right? The health interior. And there's only so limited. So what I did, I used to do a lot of groups with better than one-to-one. So I used to do about 200 clients a year. Group files and individual files, there's no difference. And also do a lot of reporting. We used to do the MAS, DAS, medical trigger screening team in the past. Then we started doing gains and wholeness. And it was sometimes the culture, sometimes the majority of the South Asian community, it wouldn't really count because it's created by someone who's Caucasian. It doesn't reflect what we're going through, what we're dealing with. And our way of dealing with substance misuse is way different than mainstream. And when mainstream, someone uses drugs, usually kicked onto the streets pretty quick. You give them the punt like a soccer ball or football. The South Asian community, when someone is drinking or using drugs, it impacts usually 100 people in the family, because you're looking at the extended family, friends, peers, but also relatives outside in India or other parts of the world, and also the wife's side as well. Everybody's impacted. It's like, how would you want to say, it's like a flu that impacts everybody going down. And that's what we worked with. And what I noticed in the South Asian community was, we started working with a lot of these guys. I would send them to AA. They had to go to a meeting. I'm like, hey, you got to go to a meeting because the probation officer sent it, and it's mandated. And they have these clauses where they're not allowed to drink, because I always argue that they should get that condition changed, because when someone relapses, just like diabetes, just like asthma, you're good for a while, you drink, you quit for a while, you are going to slip. A lot of these guys that have a slip, they're back in the custody center, back in jail, or I call it carrying a breach. And so communication is very key. The way you communicate, the way you talk to them, because this is the first person that they're opening up to. And that's very important, because the trust is very important. And you need to do at least a minimum of, like Dr. Sudhir earlier, minimum 12 sessions. And we were used to be funded for like 10 sessions. And I was just like, whatever, man. It takes 10 sessions just to build a small relationship with them. And with addictions, when the family's involved, they thrive quite well. So what I did in my job was, if someone wanted to get off drugs, get into a treatment center, I would just tell them, come back tomorrow. We fill out the paperwork in one day. General mainstream, it takes about like 4 or 5 weeks or 4 or 5 sessions, many months. And I'll just bypass it, fill out the paperwork, and we would send them to a treatment center of their choice. A lot of them would go in Surrey or at Abbotsford or even in Vancouver, right? So we worked with a team, like I got to know a lot of the addiction doctors that were South Asian. We send them there. And I had a doctor I worked with, addiction specialist. He asked you, how should I set up my clinic? What days? I go, you can't do it during the daytime. Nobody's going to come see you. 9 to 5? Impossible. But he would set it up on Wednesday evenings, Saturday mornings, and Sunday all day. The guy would be fully packed. Like we talked about earlier, like when someone wants to kick addictions, 80% persons up to the person to make the change, and 20% counseling and medication. And also with South Asian community, I noticed with the men I worked with, they also had a connection to the Sikh temple. Even some of the gang members I worked with that have passed away when I was younger, growing up with them, they all had a connection to the Sikh temple because spirituality is a big key. And they all remember going to the temple with their family, with their grandparents, and it meant a lot to them. Sometimes that's a great connection as well to have too, right? So also and also the best style that I noticed I worked with, motivational interviewing. That's probably the best skill working with South Asian clients. Am I 1, 2, or 3? There might be 4 or 5 even now, right? I'm not sure, but that really works. And most of the clients I worked with, they all came from the Punjab. I worked with some clients that came from Fiji as well, because when we were funded, we were specifically for South Asian community. You only worked with clients from India, Fiji, Pakistan, and around here. You can work with someone, let's say, South Asian, let's say they're from Sri Lanka or Afghanistan. It wasn't part of the contract back then, but it's all changed the last couple of years because of immigration, and just the government has kind of like starting to realize get more open opportunities. And for South Asian community, you look at when I worked in Surrey, South Fraser Health Region serves from Boston Bar to Burnaby, right? When you talk about addictions counseling, you probably had about 3 for all of that area, South Fraser. When we're not even talking about other cultural backgrounds such as Mandarin, Cantonese, Korean, or even like other parts, other community. There's no counselors to speak the language for nonprofit and mainstream counseling. It's done through interpreter, but sometimes the problem with interpreters, maybe it's such a small community and they're both from the same community. Sometimes privacy issues come into play, and sometimes that could play a role as well too, right? So when a lot of these works with, like I said, the average age of drinking was 26. Well, that was the age that I got to. And I asked them, how come you never drank in India? They said that family support, no pressure. They just very laid back. Came here, had to adjust, and started working right away. And I guess drinking was kind of like an outlet. Nobody ever thought like, hey, let's go to the gym, let's go for a walk. Sometimes I worked with many clients who've been in Canada for like 10, 15 years in Lower Mainland, never been to White Rock Beach before. All they do is work. So the average South Asian person, man, usually works around 6 days a week, about 10 to 15 hours a day. They work in construction, they work in trades, and also many of them didn't do drugs. The ones that did drugs, for opiate drugs, for example, they did heroin was the main choice of drug. And many of these young men or these gentlemen I worked with, they didn't know the type of drug they're doing. They said they're doing cocaine, but they're actually doing heroin. Because back in the Punjab, they use the same term. It's called chitta. That's called heroin. In the Punjab, here in Canada, we call cocaine, we call it chitta here, right? And so I asked them, like, how did you start using hard drugs? And most of the response they gave was that they came here, they didn't have any friends, they started working, they're working a labor job. Someone kind of introduced them to them, hey, take this stuff, you'll feel good, you're not going to get addicted. A couple weeks later, they would be addicted to that, right? And best time one time working with them in the evening time and weekends. Even sometimes I even question, some people work in the health authority, gotta be the only minority person in the room. And I would ask them, hey, why don't you guys work in the evening times longer? Well, we just work 8 to 4 and we go home. But you gotta think outside the box because many people work long hours and it's different now, right? And many of the clients I worked with, they worked full time, they owned a house, they rented. Many of them, very rare, were on the streets or homeless. So when you think about addiction, you think like this person, that person. They don't fit that. They don't fit the traditional client for that. When working in that, right? They're employed full time. Their physical health was good, mental health, legal problems. A lot of them, it's domestic violence, drinking together. That's what they came for. Education was low. They learned in India. They didn't learn here. And and when I look at it now compared to 20 years ago, with a South Asian community, a lot of it was like cigarettes and drinking, but now it's like quite open. And also when we talk about like fetal alcohol syndrome, FASD, you didn't see many South Asian women drinking back in the day when they were younger, but now it's different because we're 3rd, 4th, 5th generation, very, very, very Western style. So we're having all these issues come up. And with the South Fraser region, the South Asian community is the main minority besides Caucasians that access counseling programs. It used to be an Indigenous community before, but with the growth of the South Asian population in the last 10 years, we've become the main minority that are accessing services and programs. And like I said, we do have a treatment center in Fraser Health that is funded for free, but we need many more services to access, not just for our community, but for everyone else. So a lot of things going on, especially nowadays, where the overdose crisis is huge. Like I've talked to a lot of people, we've seen a lot of South Asian men overdosing from drugs. And a lot of the international students have come here, and there've been some deaths that have occurred because in the Punjab, heroin comes through Pakistan into Punjab, then it goes out into the world, right? And when they come here, they think they're using fentanyl, they think it's heroin, and they're overdosing as well. So that's just a brief thing that I've done. The biggest thing is running groups is good. I've given like thousands of letters when I was doing this work, and never got subpoenaed by the courts or the Crown knew me. The Crown knew me. The lawyers would know me. I'd give a letter. It'd be free. But majority of these guys, weekends work best for clients, and also work in the evening time, like Dr. Sidhu said, working late in the evening. makes a big difference for them. And also the programs are funded, but there's huge wait lists. With what I noticed with the community, South Asian community, there's a lot of more trauma now, and the clients are more complex than before because you have to look at economics, how everything's so expensive. And also a lot of the families that are coming to Canada now, they're having problems adjusting to the high school system because the schools are so overloaded and there's not enough services available. If I had a wait list, if I had a wish list, it'd be this long, you know what I mean? With me, I run into people in the streets, in the community. I usually make a blueprint in about 10 minutes for addictions. Make a plan, what they want to do, where they get help and support. So, and also a lot of the services are free. Many of the minority groups just in general, they don't know where to get services from. They don't know what an alcohol drug counselor is, what a youth worker is, or even like sometimes even a psychologist is. They're not aware these services are available. We're trying to break that stereotype. It's 2022, but I've done radio shows, TV shows. We talk about these great services that are available, but many people aren't still aware. And also, we have got to start thinking outside the box for other services. You know what I mean? Like you look at Vancouver Coastal Health. I'm not sure how many drug and alcohol counselors they have that are not Caucasian or other cultural backgrounds. You know what I mean? We talk about it when I work at Option Community Services. Me and the team I work, we go into multi-million-dollar homes, like $4 or $5 million homes, and there's a disconnect between the parent and the youth. And a lot of the times, we're mobile. We're not office-based, so we have a clinical counselor as well. They will actually go into clients' homes, and we meet with them in the community. So we don't just sit in an office and say, hey, come on in, and be outpatient-based. We actually work in the community, and we work outside the box. I work sometimes I work to Fridays like 7:30 o'clock, 7 o'clock, and we're making a connection. And also there's a big disconnect between the parents and the kids. Many of the youth I've seen that went up into the gangsterism. The father drank, and there's nobody to look up to. And then they find kids where they want to get their needs met and stuff, right? And I'm pretty good at doing trends. So we talked about the opiates crisis. I was doing presentations in Surrey high schools in 2013 and 2014. And I talked about there's going to be a big crisis going to happen when this drug comes to the Lower Mainland. That's happened. And we need more peer support, and also the risk of fentanyl. In the Punjab, it's like pizza. You can get the Punjab anywhere you want, pure heroin, right? But the thing with fentanyl, a lot of people don't know about it. And alcohol is, in the Punjab, they're very expensive. Here it's very cheap. So that's a lot of South Asians. You see a lot of men, they say, hey, I'll work 1 hour, I can buy a bottle of alcohol, you know what I mean? And also there's a lot of misconceptions about drinking as well in the community. Many of our songs and like movies, they endorse alcohol, you know what I mean, this and that. And also with drinking, they say drink is good for you, it's healthy for you. It's not actually. We're trying to break that barrier and that cycle, you know what I mean? But like I was talking the other day, they were telling me, a police officer, I was talking to some guy about drinking and driving. He goes, well, the cops, they make more money when they bust me. I go, that's not true. There's a lot of misconceptions. A lot of other cultures too, right? So we're trying to break that barrier. Yeah, so these are just some things that are available in the community. So I've made referrals to treatment centers, to counsel, but I think what I've done is I've seen men that have kicked alcohol for like 8-9 years, and I've gone to their cakes and stuff for AA. I'm not in AA, but when I walk into a room, I'm well recognized because I sent many people there and actually changed their way of life. Also with AA, they have Punjabi AA meetings, alcohol anonymous meetings, and when someone takes the cake, there's 300 or 400 people there. It's a big festival, and also lots of food. And they talk about how usually on Wednesdays in Bear Creek, usually about 50, 60 people at the meetings for AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. They also have Alateen as well too now, a little bit. So we're getting the word out. There's a lot of community support available for addictions, but we need to do more. And also I just feel that the health authorities could offer a lot more services, not just to South Asian community, but to every community as well. And also with South Asian community, you're seeing a lot more women and girls using alcohol and drugs compared to 20 years ago. The stats are quite different than before. And also they don't release the stats that much for South Asian community because there'll be a major uproar. Like alcohol is the main choice of drug in Canada. You know, you can look at the data for that. In opiates crisis, not a very small percentage of the community uses drugs, and so we needed more awareness around substance misuse. When I first started in the field, we used to ask, what was your choice of drug on a checklist, and alcohol was never even on the checklist like 25 years ago. It was always cannabis. So if you look at it now, I talk to a lot of men, they say that alcohol is the main choice of substance. Yeah, so I've seen every situation you can think. I've worked with many different young people, like sex offender youth, high-risk youth that have committed violent crime. But they're young people. Young people are the future too, right? And so we're just trying to make a dent to the thing. And for treatment-wise, there's a big wish list. I think the government's doing the best they can at the present time. But I feel like they could support more multicultural-based people from all over the world. Everybody's coming here, but it's very hard to get. So even as translators, sometimes you can't even find the language. And also, if you bring a translator who wants to do private, you have to pay for the translator, which can be very expensive as well, too. I'm just looking at my time. I don't want to take too much time up, a couple of minutes here. Anybody have any questions or anything?
Just so you said you have worked with people who have kind of been a part of previously that, like a gang life. Is that accurate?
Yeah. Like they've been in gangs, yes.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by like what pulls, especially young men into gangs. And
Yeah.
I think I have an idea. It's like power, belonging, status, all these things, and it's like, to me, part of the solution has always seemed like, how do you provide those things elsewhere? And I'm interested in what you think about it.
Yeah, so one of the things is having a mentor, right? And if you can't do it, if your father's not involved in your family life when you're young, when you get older, you're going to find that somewhere else. So I always tell parents is that the biggest key when your kid goes to grade 8 to grade 10, that's the thing. A lot of the young people I work with, they got into trouble. Their parents have switched their schools when they're grade 8. So I always tell parents, hey, don't switch your kid's school once they hit grade 6 or grade 7, because when now they got to make new friends, and they'll find other vacuums that kids that want to belong. And I always told kids that if you want to be a really good, good drug trafficker, you should become a pharmacist. We all laugh about that, you know what I mean? So a lot of it's a mentorship. You catch them at an early age, because you're seeing kids that are grade 5, grade 6 get into this. And social media, like the phone is a great creator, but it plays a huge role in young people getting caught up in this gang war stuff. And what you see is a lot of the kids think that, hey, go on social media, it's cool, I got to wear these shoes stuff. And so we break that barrier. We tell them that most guys that sell drugs, like the drug peddler, the guys, the street dealer, they usually make about $200 a day on a 12-hour shift. Now usually you can make that much working a Chevron gas station, being a gas attendant and having AC all day too, right? So we should break that barrier, break that cycle. The younger you get them, the better it is. A lot of them are influenced by social media. And a lot of these kids don't know what they're getting into or what they're doing. And they'll make a really bad decision. They're easily recruited. A lot of these kids, they want to belong, but they don't have that. They need that male positive role model. And it starts in the home. If you don't get a home, trouble will find you. And some of the parents will switch their kids' schools halfway through, and I tell them you shouldn't do that after grade 6. That's my personal opinion. And that's what I noticed a lot of these kids. I've talked to some guys that got into gangs, they got into substance misuse problems, and they talked about like where the errors were made. Crucial 13 to 15. Grade 8, grade 9, grade 10, those 3 years, guide your kids. And the thing, high school is just about social media now. Hanging out. It's not really about the grades and stuff like that. And what you want to do is you want to guide these kids in the right way. And it's quite fascinating when I meet a youth and you ask them what happened. They all got caught up in the moment. Like we talk about mindfulness. Mindfulness should be starting at an early level, like grade 5, grade 6 for young kids. And they should teach kids about how to deal with emotions as a high school curriculum course. That's what I think. Not in grade 11, grade 12, but in the grade 8, grade 9. A lot of young kids, they're on the phone and they don't know how to communicate no more. Like hand in hand, everything's on texting and WhatsApp, or all the chats they use and stuff. So they don't actually know how to engage properly. In the brain development, you look at it's still 25. We tell a lot of parents, like when you grow up, especially South Asian parents tell them, when you grow up at a different time, your kids growing up, don't compare the two and treat them as who they are and stuff. And yeah, mentoring's the biggest key. A lot of parents say, well, I talked to a lot of parents that are very wealthy, and I worked with Think in Addiction. They said that, hey, look, I provide my kids with shoes, car, I work for them. I tell them anybody can do that with a Visa card, right? But you got to give your kids love and nurture. That's the biggest key. They go, well, my kids don't listen. How do you discipline them? Well, hitting them, that's not the answer. You hit them in the pocketbook. Don't give them a driver's license. Cut the internet, and don't give them a phone. I believe that, my personal opinion, you don't give a kid the phone until they're 14. And kids need to be outside playing sports and stuff and getting out. I've seen a lot of kids that are very successful. They got a car, and they start hanging the wrong crowd, and they stop playing sports at 16. All of a sudden, they're 19, 20. The parents have no idea what's going on, and they've passed away. A lot of these kids are a lot of the kids, BC is really a unique situation with gang violence because they don't fit the criteria of who should be in a gang, because they all come from pretty good families. They're not broken families like sometimes look at the inner cities of other parts of the world. In BC, it doesn't make sense, especially where I work in Surrey. So I work in Newton, where that's where the most shootings have occurred. And people say Newton's an unsafe place to be. Only it's a beautiful place to go for a walk, go to Costco, you got nothing to worry about and stuff. And many young kids carry knives on them for protection. I go, well, how come? They're like, well, you never know what can happen. I'm like, so they're just, social media plays a huge role in that. And as I guess as parents, we have to change. I got 2 teenagers that are 19. Spend a lot of time with them, but we tell parents to spend time with their kids. If you don't spend time with your kids, what are you going to do? They're going to find other ways to cope, and they usually get in trouble. One question I ask South Asian parents is, when do you think most crime occurs in Canada? They say at nighttime, but it occurs between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. The reason is, who gets out of school between 3 and 6? Kids. Where are our parents? Parents work. I grew up in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s. We always had, my mom was always home. But that's just both parents work and stuff. So yeah. Does that answer that question, kind of?
Oh,
yeah.
We're coming to the end of our class time today, and I want to make sure students can leave on time, but I wish we had time for more questions, but I really do appreciate TJ, you coming here. And
Yeah, thank you for having me here.
Experience working with South Asian community, the gang community, the addictions community as well.
Yeah.
So give a big hand. Thank you.
Like even meeting Dr. Betty, I met him through someone that was one of his students.
Oh, cool.
From like,
Can we visit?